When Colonel Frank Montgomery spotted the jagged scars across Captain Andrea Wells' face and arms during the Fox Hollow VFW meeting, his cruel laughter echoed through the hall for every veteran to hear. The twisted flesh and visible damage made her an easy target for mockery in front of the entire post membership. What Montgomery didn't know was that those seemingly disfiguring marks represented one of the most heroic actions in modern naval history. By the time the Navy Cross tattoo on her shoulder was revealed, Montgomery had already sealed his fate in front of his own community. Some scars fade with time, but the courage they represent burns eternal. And this particular decoration outranked every piece of brass in the building. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Steam rose from the grill at Palmer's Diner as Andy Wells flipped another batch of hash browns, her movements precise despite the early hour. The October heat in Fox Hollow, Texas hadn't broken yet, and the ancient air conditioning unit wheezed against the humidity that seemed to seep through every crack in the building. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, careful not to let her scarred hands touch her face where customers might see. The scars drew stares wherever she went. 3 years since moving to Fox Hollow, and people still turned their heads when she walked past, their eyes lingering on the jagged lines that traced from her left temple down to her jaw, and the puckered flesh that covered her forearms where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. Children pointed until their mothers hushed them. Adults tried to be polite, but their discomfort showed in quick glances and nervous conversations that died when she approached. "Order up," Andy called, sliding 2 plates of eggs and bacon across the pass-through window. Her voice carried the slight rasp that came from smoke inhalation damage to her vocal cords, another gift from the day that had changed everything. Judy Palmer, the diner's owner, grabbed the plates with a smile that had become genuine over the months they'd worked together. At 62, Judy had seen enough of life to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance. She'd hired Andy based on her references from the VA Medical Center in Houston, where administrators had spoken in glowing terms about her work ethic and technical skills. "Table 6 is asking about the new cook," Judy said, nodding toward a booth where 2 middle-aged men in work shirts sat nursing their coffee. "Told them you make the best breakfast in East Texas." Andy glanced through the window at the customers, recognizing them as regulars who'd been coming to Palmer's since before she started working there. They'd never spoken directly to her, though she'd caught them whispering about her appearance on several occasions. "What they really want to know is what happened to my face," Andy said, cracking eggs onto the grill with practiced efficiency. "Same as everyone else." Judy's expression softened with maternal concern that had made her a surrogate mother to half the young people in Fox Hollow. "You know you don't owe anyone explanations about your personal business." "I know." Andy arranged bacon strips in neat rows, the repetitive motion helping to calm the anxiety that still surfaced whenever she felt observed. "Doesn't stop them from being curious." The diner's bell chimed as Cameron Mills pushed through the front door, his 17-year-old frame still gangly with adolescence, but his eyes holding the kind of old soul awareness that came from growing up fast. He worked part-time at Webb's Auto Repair down the street and had become one of Andy's few genuine friends in Fox Hollow. "Hey, Miss Andy," Cameron said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Mom's making me pick up breakfast before school. Says our kitchen's too messy to cook in." Andy smiled, the expression transforming her scarred features in ways that reminded people she'd once been beautiful. Cameron was one of the few locals who looked directly at her when they spoke, treating her scars as just another part of who she was rather than something to be pitied or feared. "The usual?" she asked, already reaching for eggs and sausage. "Yes, ma'am, and maybe some of those hash browns if you've got extra." Linda Mills pushed through the door behind her son, her pressed real estate blazer and carefully styled hair marking her as one of Fox Hollow's more successful residents. Her smile was polite, but didn't reach her eyes when she looked at Andy. "Cameron, you could have called ahead," Linda said, her tone carrying the kind of strained patience that suggested ongoing arguments about his choice of hangouts. "Miss Andy doesn't mind," Cameron replied, accepting the plate she slid across the counter. "Besides, food's better here than anywhere else in town." Linda's gaze flicked to Andy's scars before settling on her son. "We've talked about this. There are other places to eat breakfast." The words stung more than Andy cared to admit. She'd grown accustomed to the stares and whispers, but Linda Mills, obvious discomfort with her son spending time around someone who looked damaged, felt like a deeper rejection. "Cameron's always welcome here," Andy said quietly, meeting Linda's eyes with the steady gaze she'd learned during military service. "He's a good kid who treats people with respect." The implied criticism wasn't lost on Linda, whose cheeks flushed with embarrassment at being called out on her prejudice. She mumbled something about being late for a showing and left Cameron to finish his breakfast alone. "Sorry about that," Cameron said after his mother disappeared. "She's not usually—" "It's okay," Andy interrupted, though they both knew it wasn't. "People see what they see." Garrett Webb entered the diner with motor oil under his fingernails and the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing his place in the community. At 35, he owned the most successful auto repair shop in Fox Hollow and had built his reputation on honest work and fair prices. Unlike most locals, he'd made an effort to get to know Andy beyond her appearance. "Coffee to go and maybe some wisdom about dealing with impossible customers," Garrett said, settling onto the stool beside Cameron. Andy poured coffee into a to-go cup, adding the cream and sugar she'd memorized from his previous visits. "Depends on whether they're impossible because they're unreasonable or because they're scared." "Scared, I think. Got a lady wants me to fix her transmission, but she won't leave the car because she doesn't trust mechanics. Says we're all crooks looking to overcharge widows." "Maybe she's had bad experiences," Andy suggested, sliding the coffee across the counter. "Sometimes people who've been hurt expect to be hurt again." Garrett studied her expression, recognizing wisdom that came from personal experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "That what happened to you? Bad experiences make you careful about trusting people?" The question was more direct than most Fox Hollow residents would dare, but Garrett had earned the right to ask through months of consistent kindness. Andy considered her response while wiping down the counter, weighing honesty against the privacy she'd worked so hard to maintain. "Something like that," she said finally. "Hard to trust new people when the old ones proved they couldn't handle seeing you at your worst." Cameron looked up from his breakfast, his young face serious with the kind of insight that surprised adults. "Is that why you moved here? To get away from people who knew you before?" Andy nodded, touched by the teenager's intuitive understanding. "Fresh start seemed like a good idea at the time." "How's that working out?" Garrett asked. She gestured toward the diner, where customers still stared and whispered about the scarred woman who cooked their food, some days better than others. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Carl Patterson, whose uniform and bearing marked him as someone accustomed to authority. At 58, he carried himself with the disciplined posture of a career military man, though his eyes held kindness that put people at ease. "Miss Wells," Patterson said with a nod that conveyed respect, "heard you helped out at the hospital last night during that emergency." Andy's part-time work as a medical technician at Fox Hollow General had become another source of community speculation, though her technical skills had earned grudging recognition from the medical staff. "Car accident on Highway 35, she explained. "Dr. Adams needed an extra pair of hands in the ER." "Driver's going to be fine because of what you did," Patterson continued. "Nurse Coleman said your emergency medical training probably saved his life." The praise felt good, but Andy remained cautious about accepting credit for skills that raised questions about her background. Her medical training went far beyond what most civilian technicians possessed, but explaining how she'd acquired those capabilities would require revealing parts of her history that remained too painful to discuss. "Just did what anyone would do," she said. Patterson's expression suggested he understood there was more to the story. "Not anyone could have done what you did. Take special training to handle trauma cases like that." Before Andy could respond, the diner's door opened to admit Colonel Frank Montgomery, whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. At 71, Montgomery commanded respect through decades of military service and community leadership, but his bearing carried an arrogance that rubbed some people the wrong way. Montgomery's eyes settled on Andy with the kind of dismissive assessment that she'd learned to recognize and dread. His gaze lingered on her scars with obvious distaste, as if her appearance was a personal affront to his sensibilities. "Sheriff," Montgomery said, nodding to Patterson while pointedly ignoring Andy. "Heard there was some excitement at the hospital last night." "Miss Wells provided emergency medical assistance that probably saved a man's life," Patterson replied, his tone carrying a subtle warning about showing proper respect. Montgomery's expression suggested he found the idea of Andy as a medical professional amusing rather than impressive. "I'm sure she did her best with whatever training she has." The condescension was barely veiled, and everyone in the diner felt the tension that followed his words. Andy continued working at the grill, but her movements had become more controlled, as if she was fighting the urge to respond to the provocation. "Colonel Montgomery," Garrett said carefully, "Andy's got more medical training than most people realize. She's been a real asset to Dr. Adams and the hospital staff." Montgomery's laugh was short and cold. "I'm sure the folks at Fox Hollow General are grateful for any help they can get, regardless of qualifications." The implication that Andy was unqualified stung, but she'd learned to endure worse treatment from people who judged her based on appearance rather than capability. What bothered her more was seeing the discomfort on Cameron's face and the anger in Garrett's eyes. "Your breakfast ready, Colonel?" she asked quietly, sliding a plate across the counter. Montgomery accepted the food without acknowledgement, leaving exact change on the counter before heading to a corner booth. His departure left the diner feeling smaller, as if his presence had consumed oxygen that was only now returning. "Don't let him get to you," Sheriff Patterson said softly. "Frank Montgomery's got his good qualities, but accepting change has never been one of them." Andy nodded, but they all knew that Montgomery's attitude represented more than personal prejudice. As commander of Fox Hollow VFW Post 847, he held influence over the veteran community that could make her life considerably more difficult if he chose to exercise it. The rest of her shift passed without incident, but Andy couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed, quiet life in Fox Hollow was about to become more complicated. Montgomery's obvious hostility suggested that her past and present were about to collide in ways she'd hoped to avoid. As she cleaned the grill and prepared to leave for her afternoon shift at the hospital, Andy caught her reflection in the diner's window. The scars looked especially prominent in the afternoon light, serving as permanent reminders of the day that had ended one life and begun another. Soon, she knew, the questions would become more insistent, and the protection of anonymity would no longer be enough to shield her from a community that demanded explanations for the damage they could see but couldn't understand. The real test would come when people discovered that her scars told a story of courage rather than victimhood, and that the woman they pitied had once been among the most decorated heroes in naval history. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Fox Hollow General Hospital buzzed with afternoon activity as Andy Wells changed into her medical technician scrubs in the women's locker room. The familiar antiseptic smell and rhythmic beeping of monitors provided a comforting contrast to the social tensions she'd navigated at Palmer's Diner. Here, among the controlled chaos of medical emergencies, her scars seemed less important than her competence. Dr. Michelle Adams appeared in the doorway, her white coat bearing coffee stains that spoke of a particularly demanding day. At 43, she carried herself with the confident exhaustion of someone who'd spent 2 decades in emergency medicine, but her eyes lit up when she saw Andy preparing for her shift. "Thank goodness you're here," Dr. Adams said, consulting the tablet that rarely left her hands. "We've got 3 post-operative patients needing monitoring, and Janet's handling intake for what looks like a multi-vehicle accident coming in from Highway 287. Andy nodded, pulling her hair back to reveal more of the scar tissue that traced along her hairline. In the hospital environment, her damaged appearance seemed less shocking, perhaps because everyone here dealt with trauma and injury as routine parts of their workday. "Vitals and medication schedules are updated?" Andy asked, washing her hands with a thoroughness that had become second nature. "Everything's current, but I want you to pay special attention to Mr. Rodriguez in room 12. His surgical site isn't healing as well as I'd like, and there might be signs of infection developing." Andy made mental notes while reviewing patient charts on her assigned tablet. Her ability to spot complications before they became critical had earned respect from the medical staff, though most attributed her skills to natural aptitude rather than specialized training. Nurse Janet Coleman emerged from the supply closet, carrying armloads of IV equipment, her graying hair escaping from a ponytail that had seen better days. At 57, Janet had worked at Fox Hollow General longer than anyone except Dr. Adams, and her opinion carried weight throughout the hospital. "Andy, honey, can you help me set up Trauma Bay 2? Janet asked. "State police are bringing in casualties from a head-on collision, and it sounds like we're going to need all the space we can get." The request wasn't unusual, but Andy's response revealed capabilities that went beyond standard technician training. She moved through the trauma bay with precise efficiency, positioning equipment and preparing supplies with the kind of anticipatory thinking that emergency medicine demanded. Her scarred hands worked without hesitation, muscle memory guiding movements that had been perfected under far more challenging conditions. "Where did you learn to set up a trauma bay like that?" Janet asked, watching Andy arrange surgical instruments in patterns that suggested extensive experience with emergency procedures. "Previous job," Andy replied simply, avoiding details that would raise questions about her background. The automatic doors burst open as paramedics wheeled in the first casualty, a middle-aged woman with multiple lacerations and obvious signs of internal bleeding. Dr. Adams immediately took charge, barking orders while assessing injuries that would require immediate surgery. "I need 2 units of O-negative stat," Dr. Adams called out, "and someone prep OR3 for emergency surgery." Andy moved into position beside the gurney, her hands already reaching for equipment before Dr. Adams could ask for it. Her ability to anticipate needs and respond without verbal instruction marked her as someone with extensive trauma experience, though her official qualifications suggested only basic technician training. "Pulse is weak and thready," Andy reported, monitoring vital signs that painted a dangerous picture. "Blood pressure dropping rapidly, she's going into shock." Dr. Adams glanced at Andy with surprise, not because the assessment was wrong, but because it demonstrated diagnostic skills that exceeded her supposed training level. The observation was accurate and delivered with the kind of clinical detachment that came from extensive experience with life-threatening injuries. "Start a second IV line," Dr. Adams ordered, already moving to address the patient's most critical injuries. "And push fluids to maintain blood pressure until we can get her to surgery." Andy's response was immediate and professional, establishing IV access with a competence that impressed even Janet Coleman's experienced eye. Her movements showed none of the hesitation that characterized most technicians when dealing with critical cases. Instead, she worked with the confidence of someone who'd handled similar emergencies countless times before. The second casualty arrived as they were preparing the first patient for surgery, and Andy found herself dividing her attention between multiple critically injured individuals. The scenario demanded exactly the kind of multitasking and prioritization skills that few civilian medical workers ever developed. "Andy, can you handle Mr. Johnson's chest tube while I stabilize Mrs. Patterson?" Dr. Adams asked, trusting her with a procedure that was technically beyond her job description. Without hesitation, Andy moved to the second patient and began monitoring the chest tube that was draining blood from around his collapsed lung. Her assessment was quick but thorough, identifying complications that could prove fatal if not addressed immediately. "Doctor, his lung isn't re-expanding properly," she reported. "The tube might be blocked, or there could be additional bleeding that we're not seeing." Dr. Adams looked over from her own patient, recognizing both the accuracy of Andy's observation and the expertise required to make such a diagnosis. "Can you clear the blockage?" "Already on it," Andy replied, using techniques that would have impressed trauma surgeons at major metropolitan hospitals. Her scarred hands worked with steady precision, clearing the obstruction and restoring proper drainage in movements that spoke of extensive experience with battlefield medicine. The crisis lasted 3 hours, during which Andy demonstrated capabilities that far exceeded anything in her official personnel file. She managed multiple patients simultaneously, anticipated complications before they became critical, and performed procedures that were technically beyond her authorized scope of practice. Most importantly, she did it all with a calm professionalism that kept everyone else focused during the chaos. When the last patient was stabilized and transferred to the ICU, Dr. Adams cornered Andy in the break room, where she was finally allowing herself a few minutes to decompress from the adrenaline rush. "That was extraordinary work today," Dr. Adams said, settling into a chair across from Andy with coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. "I've never seen a technician with your level of trauma experience." Andy sipped her own coffee, considering how to respond without revealing information that would raise more questions. Some places provide better training than others. "This wasn't just training," Dr. Adams pressed gently. "The way you handled those chest tubes, your diagnostic skills, the way you managed multiple critical patients simultaneously, that comes from extensive hands-on experience with major trauma cases." The conversation was moving toward territory that Andy preferred to avoid, but Dr. Adams' curiosity seemed genuine rather than intrusive. After months of working together, she'd earned the right to ask questions about capabilities that obviously exceeded standard qualifications. "I worked in high-stress medical environments before coming to Fox Hollow," Andy said carefully, places where you learn to handle whatever came through the door. Dr. Adams studied Andy's scarred face, noting the careful way she chose her words. Military medicine? The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that could change how people viewed both Andy's capabilities and her past. Military medical training would explain her skills, but it would also raise questions about how she'd acquired such extensive trauma experience. Some, Andy admitted after a long pause. Before Dr. Adams could pursue the subject further, Janet Coleman appeared in the doorway with news that changed the direction of their conversation entirely. "Andy, there's a call for you at the nurses' station," Janet said. "Someone from the VFW post asking if you'd be interested in volunteering for their community health fair next month." Andy felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Her interactions with Fox Hollow's veteran community had been minimal by design, partly because her medical skills might raise questions about her military background, but mostly because she wasn't ready to face the kind of scrutiny that came from people who understood what combat experience looked like. "Did they say who was calling?" Andy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Colonel Montgomery," Janet replied. "Said he'd heard about your medical training and thought you might be willing to help with blood pressure screenings and basic health assessments." Dr. Adams raised an eyebrow, recognizing the irony in Montgomery's request. Earlier that day, he'd questioned Andy's qualifications at Palmer's Diner, but now he wanted to utilize her medical skills for community service. "Interesting," Dr. Adams murmured. "This morning he seemed skeptical about your training, and now he's asking for your help." Andy stood slowly, understanding that Montgomery's invitation was probably less about community service and more about getting a closer look at someone whose capabilities didn't match her official background. Veterans, especially those with extensive military experience, had ways of evaluating people that could reveal information she preferred to keep private. "I should probably take the call," she said, though every instinct warned her that accepting Montgomery's invitation would complicate her carefully maintained anonymity. The VFW post's community room was larger than Andy had expected, with wood-paneled walls lined with photographs of Fox Hollow veterans from conflicts spanning 7 decades. The smell of cigarette smoke and coffee hung in the air, mixed with the distinctive aroma of institutional furniture that had absorbed years of meetings and gatherings. Colonel Montgomery stood at the far end of the room beside a folding table covered with paperwork, his bearing as commanding as it had been at the diner that afternoon. But now his expression carried a different quality, as if he was seeing Andy through a lens that focused on her potential usefulness rather than her apparent damage. "Miss Wells," Montgomery said, gesturing for her to join him at the table, "thank you for coming." Several other VFW members were scattered around the room, their conversations dying as Andy approached. She recognized the dynamic immediately. Veterans assessing a newcomer, trying to determine whether she belonged in their community or was simply someone seeking to benefit from their resources. Dr. Adams said you needed volunteers for a health fair, Andy said, maintaining the neutral tone that had served her well in challenging situations. "That's right, we're partnering with the county health department to provide basic medical services for folks who can't afford regular health care." Montgomery's voice carried none of the condescension that had marked their earlier encounter. "Your supervisor speaks very highly of your technical skills." An elderly man emerged from a corner booth, his VFW cap bearing the insignia of the Korean War, and his weathered face carrying the kind of dignity that came from decades of quiet service. Walt Gibson had been introduced to Andy at various community events, but they'd never spoken at length. "Frank tells us you've got medical training that might be useful for the health fair," Walt said, his voice carrying the slight tremor of advanced age but none of its weakness. "Not many people in Fox Hollow have the kind of experience needed for community health work." Andy nodded politely, sensing that Gibson's involvement represented a different dynamic than Montgomery's leadership. Where the colonel commanded through authority, Gibson seemed to lead through earned respect. "I'm willing to help however I can," she said, "though my qualifications might not be exactly what you're looking for." "What kind of training do you have?" Montgomery asked, his tone suggesting that her answer would determine whether she was welcome in their veteran community. The question was loaded with implications that extended beyond the health fair. Veterans, particularly those with combat experience, had ways of recognizing each other that went beyond official documentation. Her response would either satisfy their curiosity or raise suspicions that could make her life in Fox Hollow considerably more complicated. "Basic emergency medical training," Andy replied carefully. "Trauma response, patient stabilization, that sort of thing." Bobby Ray Tucker, a younger veteran whose Iraq War service had left him with visible injuries of his own, looked up from the magazine he'd been reading. At 34, he represented a different generation of Fox Hollow veterans. But his assessment of Andy carried the same weight as the older members' opinions. Basic training doesn't usually cover the kind of trauma procedures that Dr. Adams was talking about, Bobby Ray observed. She said you handled multiple critical patients like someone with extensive field experience. Andy felt the familiar tension that came whenever people began connecting dots that could reveal information she preferred to keep private. Her skills were the result of extensive military medical training, but explaining that would require discussions about her service that she wasn't ready to have. Some training programs are more comprehensive than others, she said, hoping to deflect further inquiry. Montgomery studied her expression with the kind of analytical attention that suggested he suspected there was more to her background than she was willing to admit. His military experience had taught him to recognize evasion, and Andy's careful responses were raising questions rather than answering them. "Miss Wells," Montgomery said slowly, "are you a veteran?" The direct question cut through all the careful maneuvering that had characterized their conversation. Every person in the room turned their attention to Andy, waiting for an answer that would either establish her credentials or confirm their suspicions that she was hiding something significant. Andy looked around the room at faces that represented decades of military service, understanding that her response would determine not just her involvement in the health fair, but her place in Fox Hollow's veteran community. These men had earned the right to ask direct questions about military service, but answering honestly would expose aspects of her past that she'd worked hard to protect. "Yes," she said quietly, "I served in the Navy." The admission changed the atmosphere in the room immediately, though not in ways that made Andy feel more comfortable. Instead of acceptance, her revelation seemed to intensify their curiosity about why she'd been so reluctant to acknowledge her military background. Walt Gibson leaned forward, his experienced eyes studying Andy's scars with new understanding. Combat service? The question touched on memories that Andy had spent 3 years trying to process. Experiences that remained too painful and too complicated to discuss with people who hadn't shared similar trauma. Her scars told only part of the story, and the rest was classified at levels that prevented detailed explanation. "Some," she said, using the same evasive response that had worked with Dr. Adams. Montgomery's expression suggested that her reluctance to provide details was raising more suspicions than it was resolving. Veterans who'd served in combat usually took pride in their service and were willing to discuss their experiences with others who understood the challenges they'd faced. "What unit?" Montgomery asked, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting direct answers to direct questions. Andy realized that her carefully constructed privacy was colliding with a community that demanded honesty from its members. She could continue evading their questions, but that would probably result in exclusion from the veteran support network that Fox Hollow provided. Alternatively, she could begin revealing information that might ultimately lead to exposure of service records that she preferred to keep confidential. "Navy medical," she said, choosing to provide minimal information that was technically accurate but didn't reveal the full extent of her background. The response seemed to satisfy some of their curiosity while raising new questions about why a Navy medic would be reluctant to discuss her service with other veterans. Medical personnel typically took pride in their contributions and were respected throughout the military community for their life-saving work. "Well," Montgomery said after a pause that felt longer than it actually was, "medical training would certainly be valuable for our health fair. When can you start helping with the planning?" Andy recognized that accepting Montgomery's invitation would mean increased scrutiny from people who possessed the experience and connections to investigate her background more thoroughly than civilian employers ever could. But refusing would probably result in social isolation that could make her remaining time in Fox Hollow uncomfortable. "I can help with whatever you need," she said, understanding that her quiet life was about to become significantly more complicated. Nightmares visited Andy Wells with clockwork regularity, always arriving between 3 and 4 in the morning when her defenses were weakest. Tonight's dream transported her back to the burning helicopter in Helmand Province, where screams mixed with the rotor wash and smoke filled her lungs like liquid fire. She jolted awake in her small apartment above Webb's Auto Repair, sweat soaking through her t-shirt, despite the October chill that had finally broken Fox Hollow's brutal heat. The digital clock glowed 3:47 a.m., and Andy knew from experience that sleep wouldn't return. She padded to the kitchenette, her bare feet silent on the worn linoleum, and started coffee that would fuel another day of maintaining the careful balance between helping her community and protecting her privacy. Through her window, Fox Hollow's main street stretched empty under streetlights that had illuminated the same storefronts for decades. Webb's Auto Repair sat directly below her apartment, its familiar smell of motor oil and metal providing an oddly comforting anchor to the present. Garrett had offered her the upstairs space at a rent she could actually afford, asking no questions about why she preferred isolation to the boarding house where most of Fox Hollow's single residents lived. The coffee maker gurgled to life as memories from the dream clung like spiderwebs she couldn't quite brush away. Corpsman Dale Morrison's voice echoed in her mind, calling her name across impossible distances. Captain Rick Stone's final radio transmission played on repeat, mixing with the sound of helicopter blades and automatic weapons fire that had defined the worst day of her naval career. Andy pulled on jeans and a long-sleeve shirt that covered the worst of her arm scarring, then settled at her small table with coffee and the notebook where she'd been sketching plans for the VFW health fair. The work provided necessary distraction from memories that therapy had helped her manage but never completely eliminate. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Adams, "Early surgery scheduled. Could use your help prepping if you're available." The message was a lifeline, offering structure and purpose that would carry her through the dangerous hours between nightmare and dawn. Andy responded immediately, grateful for work that demanded complete attention and left no room for dwelling on the past. Fox Hollow General's parking lot held only a few cars, belonging to overnight staff and early arriving surgical personnel. Andy used her employee badge to enter through the emergency department, where the fluorescent lighting felt harsh after the soft darkness of her apartment. Dr. Adams met her at the nurses' station, looking alert despite the early hour. "Thanks for coming in. We've got a complicated appendectomy that might turn into something more serious if the patient's condition deteriorates." Andy nodded, slipping into work mode with relief. Medical emergencies provided the kind of focus that kept her mind occupied and her hands busy, leaving no energy for the anxiety that could overwhelm her during quiet moments. "Patient history?" she asked, reviewing charts while they walked toward the surgical prep area. 67-year-old male, diabetic, with what appeared to be routine appendicitis until his white blood cell count spiked overnight. Now we're looking at possible peritonitis and the need for extensive abdominal surgery. The case required exactly the kind of complex medical management that Andy had mastered during her naval service, though she was careful to demonstrate only the skills that her official training could reasonably explain. Her movements remained precise and anticipatory, but she avoided displaying the kind of advanced trauma techniques that would raise questions about her background. Janet Coleman arrived as they were setting up the surgical suite, her experienced presence adding another layer of competence to their team. She'd worked enough shifts with Andy to recognize her capabilities, but had never pressed for explanations about training that seemed to exceed her documented qualifications. "Morning, honey," Janet said, checking equipment with a thoroughness that came from decades of surgical experience. "Dr. Adams says you'll be assisting with monitoring during the procedure." "Happy to help wherever you need me," Andy replied, double-checking medications and ensuring that emergency protocols were ready in case the patient's condition worsened during surgery. The operation lasted 3 hours, during which Andy demonstrated the kind of calm professionalism that impressed both Dr. Adams and Janet Coleman. She anticipated needs, provided accurate assessments, and managed multiple monitoring systems with a competence that spoke of extensive experience with complex medical procedures. "Outstanding work," Dr. Adams said as they cleaned up after successfully completing the surgery. "I don't know where you acquired your training, but you've got better surgical support skills than technicians from major metropolitan hospitals." Andy accepted the praise while deflecting curiosity about her background, a balancing act that had become second nature during her time in Fox Hollow. Her capabilities were the result of extensive naval medical training, but explaining that would require discussing experiences she wasn't ready to share. The rest of her hospital shift passed without major incidents, though she noticed several staff members watching her work with expressions that suggested growing curiosity about her qualifications. Dr. Adams had clearly been discussing her capabilities with other medical personnel, which could lead to questions that became increasingly difficult to answer evasively. By mid-afternoon, Andy was back at Palmer's Diner, where the lunch crowd was thinning and Judy Palmer was preparing for the dinner rush. The transition from medical emergencies to food service felt jarring. But Andy had learned to compartmentalize different aspects of her life to prevent overwhelming anxiety. "You look tired, honey," Judy observed, noting the shadows under Andy's eyes that suggested another sleepless night. "Everything okay?" "Just a busy day at the hospital," Andy replied, tying her apron and checking the grill temperature. "Dr. Adams needed help with an early surgery." Cameron Mills pushed through the front door, still wearing his school clothes but carrying the kind of excitement that suggested something important had happened. He'd become a regular fixture at Palmer's Diner after school, treating it as a safe space where he could talk about things that mattered to him without judgment. "Miss Andy, you'll never guess what happened in history class today," Cameron said, settling onto his usual stool at the counter. "Try me," she said, starting his usual after-school snack without being asked. Mr. Peterson was talking about military heroes, and he mentioned that Fox Hollow has produced more decorated veterans per capita than any other town in East Texas. Cameron's eyes shone with pride in his community's service record. He said some of our local heroes have medals that most people have never even heard of. Andy felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of military decorations, but she maintained her neutral expression while preparing Cameron's food. "That's impressive. Fox Hollow should be proud of its veterans." Mr. Peterson said there are medals for valor that are so rare most people go their whole lives without meeting someone who's earned one. Cameron accepted his plate with enthusiasm that reminded Andy why she enjoyed his company. He said the Navy Cross is like the second highest decoration for courage, and only a few hundred people have ever received one. The mention of the Navy Cross sent ice through Andy's veins, though she kept her hands steady on the grill. Cameron had no way of knowing that his casual observation touched on the most classified and painful aspects of her military service. "Sounds like an interesting class," she managed, hoping her voice didn't betray the emotional reaction that mentioning her decoration always triggered. Mr. Peterson said that people who earn medals like that usually don't talk about what they did because the experiences were too traumatic or because the missions were classified. Cameron paused, studying Andy's scarred face with the kind of innocent curiosity that could be both endearing and dangerous. "Miss Andy, were you ever involved in classified military stuff?" The question was more direct than Andy had expected from the teenager, though she recognized that his interest came from genuine respect rather than intrusive curiosity. Cameron had become genuinely fond of her, and his questions reflected a desire to understand rather than to pry into private matters. "Military service involves a lot of different experiences," she said carefully, "some more difficult to discuss than others." Before Cameron could pursue the subject further, Colonel Montgomery entered the diner with two other VFW members that Andy recognized but had never spoken with directly. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere, bringing the kind of authoritative energy that dominated whatever space he occupied. "Miss Wells," Montgomery said with a nod that carried more respect than their previous encounters, "I hope you've had time to think about our health fair planning committee. We're meeting tomorrow evening to discuss logistics." Andy wiped her hands on her apron, sensing that Montgomery's invitation was about more than community service. His tone suggested that he'd been thinking about their conversation at the VFW post and had developed new questions about her background. "I'll be there," she said, though every instinct warned her that increased involvement with Fox Hollow's veteran community could lead to exposure of information she preferred to keep private. Walt Gibson stepped forward, his weathered face carrying the kind of dignity that came from decades of quiet leadership. "Miss Wells, Frank's been telling us about your medical capabilities. We're hoping you might be willing to help with more than just basic health screenings." The request suggested that Montgomery had been researching her background, possibly through military contacts who could access service records that civilian employers never saw. Veterans, particularly those with extensive military careers, possessed connections that could reveal information about classified service that she'd hoped would remain protected. "What kind of help did you have in mind?" Andy asked, though she suspected the answer would involve exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd been working to avoid. "We're wondering if you might be qualified to provide emergency medical training for our younger veterans," Montgomery said, his tone carrying implications that extended beyond the stated request. "Bobby Ray Tucker has been asking about advanced first aid, and your supervisor at the hospital suggests you have experience with trauma medicine." Andy realized that her carefully maintained anonymity was unraveling through the intersection of her medical capabilities and the veteran community's interest in utilizing her skills. Dr. Adams' praise for her abilities had reached Montgomery through channels she hadn't anticipated, creating pressure to either reveal more about her background or risk appearing ungrateful for the community's acceptance. "I'd be happy to help with basic first aid training," she said, hoping to limit her involvement to activities that wouldn't require detailed explanations of her qualifications. Montgomery's expression suggested that he understood her reluctance to provide specifics about her training, but that his curiosity about her background had only increased. "That's generous of you. We'll discuss the details at tomorrow's meeting." As the VFW members prepared to leave, Walt Gibson approached the counter with an expression that suggested he wanted to speak privately. "Miss Wells, can I ask you something personal?" Andy nodded, though she braced herself for questions that could force difficult choices between honesty and privacy. "Those scars," Gibson said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of understanding that came from personal experience with combat injuries, "they tell a story, don't they?" The observation was more statement than question, delivered by someone who recognized the difference between accidental injury and wounds sustained in service to others. Gibson's own service in Korea had taught him to identify the kinds of damage that came from putting yourself in harm's way to protect your teammates. "All scars tell stories," Andy replied carefully. "Some stories are worth telling," Gibson said, his tone gentle but insistent. "And some people deserve to know that the person they're looking at is a hero rather than a victim." The words hit Andy like physical blows, forcing her to confront the fundamental contradiction between her desire for privacy and her community's need to understand who she really was. Gibson's assessment suggested that her attempts to hide her military service were actually dishonoring the sacrifices she'd made and the recognition she'd earned. "Mr. Gibson," she said quietly, "some stories are too complicated to tell." "Maybe," he replied, heading toward the door. "But tomorrow night, you might find that your story needs to be heard." As the VFW members left Palmer's Diner, Andy realized that her carefully constructed quiet life in Fox Hollow was approaching a crisis point. The intersection of her medical capabilities, her military background, and the veteran community's growing interest in her qualifications was creating pressure that could no longer be managed through evasion and deflection. Cameron looked at her with concern, recognizing the tension that had followed Montgomery's visit. "Miss Andy, is everything okay? You look like something's bothering you." Andy managed a reassuring smile, though she felt anything but reassured about what tomorrow's VFW meeting might bring. "Everything's fine, Cameron. Just thinking about how to help with a community health fair." But as she returned to her work at the grill, Andy knew that her time of hiding was coming to an end. The questions were becoming more direct, the scrutiny more intense, and the pressure to reveal the truth about her service more difficult to resist. Soon, she would have to choose between continuing to protect her privacy and allowing her community to understand that the scarred woman they saw as damaged was actually one of the most decorated heroes in naval history. The sound of helicopter rotors thundered across Andy Wells' memory as she stood in the shower, letting hot water cascade over scars that would never fully fade. The date was October 15th, exactly 3 years since the evacuation from Helmand Province that had ended her naval career and begun her journey toward the quiet life she'd tried to build in Fox Hollow. Anniversary dates had a way of summoning ghosts that therapy couldn't completely banish. Andy dressed carefully for the VFW meeting, choosing a button-down shirt that covered her arms while remaining professional enough for community volunteer work. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman who'd learned to live with permanent reminders of the day she'd saved 11 Marines at the cost of her own future in the military. The Navy Cross tattoo on her left shoulder remained hidden beneath the fabric, a small eagle and anchor design that most people would assume was simple military pride rather than recognition of the second highest decoration for valor that the Navy could bestow. She'd gotten the tattoo during her recovery at Walter Reed, when pain medication couldn't dull the emotional trauma of losing her entire career identity, along with half the use of her left hand. Reverend Matt Fisher was unlocking the doors of St. Luke's Methodist Church when Andy walked past on her way to Webb's Auto Repair. The minister's warm smile and genuine concern had made him one of the few Fox Hollow residents who treated her scars as simply another aspect of who she was, rather than something to be pitied or feared. "Morning, Andy," Reverend Fisher called out, pausing in his work to offer conversation. "How are you feeling about tonight's meeting?" The question carried more weight than casual inquiry, suggesting that word of her growing involvement with the veteran community had spread through Fox Hollow's interconnected social networks. Reverend Fisher served as an unofficial counselor for many local veterans, which meant he probably understood more about her situation than she'd realized. "Nervous," Andy admitted, appreciating his directness. I'm not sure I'm ready for the kind of scrutiny that comes with being more visible in the veteran community." Reverend Fisher set down his keys and gave her his full attention, the kind of pastoral focus that had earned him respect throughout Fox Hollow. Sometimes the things we're most afraid to share are exactly what our community needs to hear. And sometimes sharing those things causes more problems than staying quiet, Andy replied, thinking about the complicated chain of events that would follow if her naval service became public knowledge. "That's true," Reverend Fisher acknowledged, "but isolation isn't a sustainable solution to dealing with trauma. At some point, healing requires community, even when community feels risky." His words followed Andy as she continued toward the auto repair shop, where Garrett Webb was already working on the engine of a pickup truck that had seen better days. The familiar sounds of mechanical work provided comfort that helped calm her anxiety about the evening's meeting. "You're up early," Garrett observed, looking up from the engine compartment with grease-stained hands and a concerned expression. "Everything okay?" Andy had grown comfortable with Garrett's straightforward approach to friendship, which included asking direct questions without demanding more information than she was willing to share. His acceptance of her privacy needs had made him one of her closest relationships in Fox Hollow. "VFW meeting tonight," she said, settling on a workbench where she could watch him work. "Colonel Montgomery wants to discuss my involvement with their health fair planning." Garrett wiped his hands on a shop rag, his expression suggesting he understood the implications of increased scrutiny from Fox Hollow's veteran community. "Frank Montgomery's a good man, but he's got strong opinions about how things should be done. Don't let him pressure you into sharing more than you're comfortable with." "What if what I'm comfortable with isn't enough for them?" Andy asked, voicing fears that had been building since Montgomery's visit to Palmer's Diner. "Veterans have ways of checking backgrounds and verifying service records that civilian employers don't use. Then they'll have to decide whether your willingness to help the community matters more than satisfying their curiosity," Garrett replied, returning to his work on the truck engine. "But Andy, if you've got military service that you're proud of, maybe it's time to stop hiding it." The suggestion was gentler than Walt Gibson's direct challenge, but it carried similar implications about the sustainability of maintaining her anonymity. Andy watched Garrett work with practiced efficiency, noting how his mechanical skills commanded respect from customers who valued competence over appearance or background. "What if my service was classified in ways that make it difficult to discuss?" she asked, testing how much she could reveal without exposing information that remained protected. Garrett paused in his work, recognizing the significance of her question. Classified service usually means important service, the kind that deserves respect, even if the details can't be shared. Before Andy could respond, Cameron Mills burst through the shop's front door with the energy of a teenager who discovered something exciting. His school backpack bounced against his hip as he approached their workstation with obvious enthusiasm. "Miss Andy, Mr. Webb," Cameron called out. "You guys need to see what I found in the school library." He pulled a thick book from his backpack, its cover bearing the title Modern Naval Heroes, Courage Under Fire, with a photograph of naval personnel in combat gear. Andy felt her stomach drop as she recognized the publication that had featured her story, along with dozens of other classified operations that had been declassified for historical documentation. "Look at this," Cameron continued, opening the book to a page that displayed photographs of various naval decorations. "Mr. Peterson was right about the Navy Cross being super rare. It says here that fewer than 700 people have ever received one, and most of the recipients were involved in operations that remained classified for decades." Andy forced herself to remain calm while examining the page that Cameron had opened to, though her pulse quickened at seeing military decorations that had defined the most important period of her life. The Navy Cross was displayed prominently among other Valor Awards, its distinctive design exactly matching the tattoo hidden beneath her shirt. "Interesting," she managed, hoping her voice didn't betray the emotional reaction that seeing the decoration always triggered. "But here's the really cool part," Cameron said, flipping to another section of the book. "Some of these operations involved medical personnel who saved lives under impossible conditions. There's this one story about a Navy corpsman who went into a burning helicopter 6 times to rescue wounded Marines." Garrett looked up from his work, noting the tension that had suddenly appeared in Andy's posture. Cameron's innocent enthusiasm was leading the conversation directly toward territory that she'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. 6 times? Garrett asked, though his attention was more focused on Andy's reaction than on Cameron's story. Yeah! The helicopter had been shot down and caught fire, but there were wounded Marines trapped inside. This corpsman kept going back in, even after getting seriously injured herself, until she'd gotten everyone out. Cameron's eyes shone with admiration for heroism that he couldn't imagine experiencing himself. She ended up with burns and shrapnel wounds that ended her military career, but she saved 11 lives. Andy stood abruptly, the sudden movement causing both Cameron and Garrett to look at her with concern. The detailed account of her actions in Helmand Province, even without her name attached, felt like exposure that left her emotionally naked. "I should get ready for work," she said, though her shift at Palmer's Diner wouldn't start for another hour. "Thanks for showing us the book, Cameron." Cameron seemed to sense that his story had caused some kind of distress, though he couldn't understand why accounts of military heroism would upset someone. "Miss Andy, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just thinking about how difficult those kinds of situations must be for the people involved," Andy replied, hoping to deflect his concern without encouraging further discussion. Garrett set down his tools and approached Andy with the kind of careful attention he'd learned to use when she seemed emotionally overwhelmed. "Andy, do you want to talk about what's bothering you?" She looked at both of them, recognizing genuine concern from people who'd become important parts of her life in Fox Hollow. Cameron's innocent curiosity and Garrett's supportive friendship represented the kind of relationship she'd hoped to build, but maintaining those connections was becoming increasingly difficult as her military background attracted more attention. "Sometimes stories about military service hit closer to home than people expect," she said carefully, choosing words that acknowledged their concern without revealing information she wasn't ready to share. "Were you involved in operations like that?" Cameron asked, his question direct but not intrusive. "Is that how you got your medical training?" Andy realized that her reaction to the book had revealed more about her background than months of careful evasion. Cameron's sharp intelligence and genuine interest in military service had led him to make connections that could expose aspects of her naval career she'd hoped to keep private. "Some experiences are difficult to discuss," she said, using the response that had become her standard deflection for questions about her service. "But Miss Andy," Cameron pressed gently, "if you did something heroic, shouldn't people know about it? Especially other veterans who would understand what you went through?" The question touched on issues that Andy had been wrestling with since moving to Fox Hollow. Her desire for privacy conflicted with the community's need to understand who she really was, and her attempts to avoid recognition were actually preventing people from appreciating the sacrifices she'd made. "Heroism is complicated, Cameron," she said, thinking about the nightmares and physical limitations that had followed her actions in Afghanistan. "Sometimes the cost of doing the right thing is higher than people realize." Garrett studied her expression with understanding that came from his own experiences with difficult decisions. "Andy, whatever happened during your service, it doesn't change who you are now. And who you are now is someone that this community values." His support meant more than Andy could easily express, but it also highlighted the fundamental contradiction in her situation. Fox Hollow's acceptance was based on their limited understanding of her background, and revealing the full truth about her naval service could complicate relationships that had become essential to her emotional well-being. "I appreciate that," she said, heading toward the door. "But tonight's meeting is going to test whether that acceptance continues when people start asking harder questions." As Andy left Webb's Auto Repair, she carried Cameron's book story with her like a weight that pressed against her chest. The teenager had unknowingly described her actions in Helmand Province with an accuracy that suggested her story had become part of military history, even if her name remained classified. The realization that her service was being documented and studied, even in anonymized form, meant that determined investigation could eventually connect her identity to operations that had earned recognition she'd never wanted to claim publicly. Tonight's VFW meeting would determine whether she could continue maintaining her privacy, or if the pressure to reveal her background had finally become too great to resist. Either way, her carefully constructed quiet life in Fox Hollow was approaching a turning point that would define her future in the community she'd grown to consider home. Walking toward Palmer's Diner through streets that had become familiar over 3 years of careful anonymity, Andy understood that some secrets were too heavy to carry indefinitely, and some stories demanded to be told regardless of the personal cost involved in their telling. Palmer's Diner hummed with late afternoon energy as Andy Wells mechanically prepared orders while her mind wrestled with the approaching VFW meeting. Each flip of hash browns and crack of eggs felt automatic, muscle memory taking over, while her thoughts circled around the increasingly impossible balance between privacy and community acceptance that defined her life in Fox Hollow. Norma Jean Butler pushed through the front door with the determined stride of someone on a mission. At 78, the VFW Auxiliary Treasurer commanded respect through decades of community service, but her sharp eyes missed nothing when it came to evaluating people's character and motivations. "Miss Wells," Norma Jean announced, settling onto a counterstool with the authority of someone accustomed to getting answers. "I need to speak with you about tonight's meeting." Andy continued working at the grill, though her attention focused entirely on the elderly woman whose opinion carried significant weight in Fox Hollow's veteran community. Norma Jean's support could make the difference between acceptance and isolation, but earning that support would require honesty that Andy wasn't certain she could provide. "What can I help you with, Mrs. Butler?" Andy asked, sliding a fresh coffee cup across the counter. "Frank Montgomery's been asking questions about your military service," Norma Jean said without preamble. "Calling contacts at the VA, checking with people who might know something about Navy medical personnel who served in Afghanistan." The words hit Andy like cold water, confirming her worst fears about increased scrutiny from people with connections throughout the military establishment. Veterans like Montgomery possessed networks that could access information civilian employers would never see, making her carefully maintained anonymity increasingly fragile. "I see," Andy managed, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured Norma Jean's coffee. "Now, I've been married to a veteran for 53 years, and I've seen enough young people come home from war to recognize someone who's carrying more than they're letting on." Norma Jean's voice carried the kind of gentle authority that had comforted countless military families through difficult transitions. "The question is whether you're hiding because you're ashamed of something, or because you're protecting something." Andy set down the coffee pot, recognizing that Norma Jean's assessment cut directly to the heart of her situation. The elderly woman's experience with military families had taught her to read between the lines when veterans were reluctant to discuss their service. "Mrs. Butler, some military experiences are complicated to explain," Andy said, using the deflection that had become her standard response to probing questions. "Honey, I've heard that explanation from more veterans than I can count," Norma Jean replied, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate movements. "Sometimes it means they did things they're not proud of. Sometimes it means they did things they can't legally discuss. And sometimes it means they did things that were so far above and beyond normal service that they don't know how to talk about them." The assessment was uncomfortably accurate, forcing Andy to confront the reality that experienced military community members could interpret her evasions more accurately than she'd realized. Norma Jean's categories covered the full spectrum of reasons why veterans might avoid discussing their service, and her tone suggested she'd already formed opinions about which category applied to Andy's situation. "Which category do you think applies to me?" Andy asked, surprised by her own directness. Norma Jean studied Andy's scarred face with eyes that had seen decades of military families dealing with the aftermath of combat service. "Honey, those scars didn't come from a training accident or a vehicle crash. They came from putting yourself in danger to help someone else. The question is whether you saved one person or a dozen." Before Andy could respond, Sheriff Carl Patterson entered the diner with the measured pace of someone who'd learned not to rush unless circumstances demanded it. His uniform was crisp despite the long day, and his expression carried the kind of professional concern that suggested official business rather than a social visit. "Afternoon, ladies," Patterson said, settling onto the stool beside Norma Jean. "Andy, I was hoping to catch you before tonight's meeting." Andy felt her anxiety spike as two of Fox Hollow's most influential community members flanked her at the diner counter. Their presence together suggested coordination that implied her situation had become a topic of broader community discussion. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" she asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer. "Got a call from the VA regional office in Houston," Patterson said, accepting the coffee Andy poured without being asked. "They're asking about a former Navy medical specialist who might be living in our area. Said they needed to verify some information for a benefits review." The words confirmed Andy's worst fears about official interest in her current location and activities. If the VA was conducting reviews that required verification of her current status, her attempts to maintain anonymity were already compromised at levels that could expose her entire background. "Did they mention a name?" Andy asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "They did," Patterson replied, his expression conveying both understanding and regret, Captain Andrea Wells, formerly of the Navy Medical Corps. Decorated veteran with classified service records and current employment in East Texas. Norma Jean turned to look at Andy with new understanding, recognizing that the conversation had shifted from speculation to confirmed fact. Captain Wells? You outrank Frank Montgomery, don't you, honey? Andy nodded slowly, understanding that her military rank would complicate her relationship with Colonel Montgomery in ways that could make tonight's meeting significantly more contentious. Army colonels and Navy captains held equivalent ranks, but Andy's medical specialization and classified service record might represent achievements that exceeded Montgomery's conventional military career. The VA wants to schedule an appointment to discuss your disability benefits and potential updates to your service-connected medical care, Patterson continued, consulting notes from his conversation with federal officials. They also mentioned something about reviewing decorations that might qualify you for additional veteran services. The mention of decorations sent ice through Andy's veins, though she tried to maintain her composure while processing the implications of official interest in her military awards. If the VA was reviewing her decorations, someone with appropriate clearances had accessed files that detailed her service in ways that could expose everything she'd worked to keep private. When do they want to schedule this appointment? Andy asked, accepting that her time of hiding was rapidly approaching its end. They're flexible on timing, but they need to verify your current address and employment status within the next 2 weeks, Patterson replied. Andy, if you need any support dealing with federal bureaucracy, the county has resources that can help veterans navigate VA procedures. His offer represented the kind of community support that had made Fox Hollow feel like home, but accepting help would require explanations about her background that she'd been avoiding for 3 years. The intersection of official interest and community curiosity was creating pressure that could no longer be managed through evasion. I appreciate that, Sheriff, Andy said, beginning to accept that her carefully constructed privacy was collapsing regardless of her preferences about disclosure. Norma Jean reached across the counter and placed her weathered hand over Andy's scarred fingers, the gesture carrying decades of experience comforting military families through difficult transitions. Honey, whatever you did during your service, this community is proud to have you. Frank Montgomery might need some time to adjust his thinking, but the rest of us understand that heroes come in all forms. The words were kind, but also revealing, suggesting that Andy's military background had already become a topic of discussion among Fox Hollow's veteran community. Her attempts to maintain anonymity had been less successful than she'd believed, and people were drawing conclusions based on limited information that might not accurately reflect her actual service. Mrs. Butler, I'm not sure hero is the right word for what I did, Andy said, thinking about the nightmares and physical limitations that had followed her actions in Afghanistan. Captain Wells, Norma Jean replied, emphasizing Andy's military rank with obvious respect. You've spent 3 years in this community helping people, working 2 jobs and contributing to everything from medical emergencies to community service. Whatever happened during your military career, your actions here speak to the kind of person you are. Patterson nodded agreement while finishing his coffee. Andy, Fox Hollow's lucky to have you, regardless of what your service records say. But tonight's meeting might be easier if people understand they're dealing with someone whose military experience gives her unique qualifications for community leadership. The suggestion that she should reveal more about her background during the VFW meeting felt both inevitable and terrifying. Andy had spent years avoiding the kind of scrutiny that came with military recognition, but her situation had evolved beyond the point where continued secrecy was sustainable. What if my military experience is classified in ways that make it difficult to discuss publicly? She asked, testing whether Patterson and Norma Jean understood the complexities involved in revealing information about sensitive operations. Then you discuss what you can, and let people draw their own conclusions about the rest, Patterson replied. Veterans understand that some service can't be detailed, but they also respect capabilities that obviously exceed normal training. Norma Jean finished her coffee and prepared to leave, but paused to deliver advice that carried the weight of decades working with military families. Honey, isolation might feel safer than exposure, but it's not sustainable for people who've dedicated their lives to serving others. At some point, healing requires community, even when community feels risky. Her words echoed Reverend Fisher's earlier observation about the necessity of connection for processing trauma, suggesting that Andy's attempts to avoid scrutiny were actually preventing the kind of relationships that could support her recovery from military service. As Patterson and Norma Jean left Palmer's diner, Andy realized that her situation had fundamentally changed during their conversation. The VA's official interest in her case meant that her background would become known to Fox Hollow's authorities regardless of her preferences about privacy. The question now was whether she would control the narrative about her service or allow others to define her based on incomplete information. Judy Palmer emerged from the kitchen with the timing that suggested she'd been monitoring the conversation from a distance. Her expression carried concern mixed with curiosity about developments that were obviously affecting her most capable employee. "Everything okay, honey?" Judy asked, though her tone suggested she understood that Andy was dealing with complications that extended beyond normal workplace issues. "The VA wants to review my benefits and update my medical care," Andy explained, choosing to share information that would soon become public knowledge anyway. "It means my military background is going to become more visible whether I want it to or not." Judy nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that her employee's situation was more complex than she'd realized. "Andy, whatever your background is, you've been the best worker I've ever had. That matters more to me than anything that happened before you came to Fox Hollow." The support felt genuine, but Andy knew that Judy's acceptance was based on limited knowledge of her actual military service. Once the full extent of her background became known, relationships throughout Fox Hollow would be tested in ways that could either strengthen her community connections or isolate her from the life she'd built. Her shift at Palmer's Diner ended with the setting sun painting Fox Hollow's main street in shades of gold and orange that reminded Andy of desert sunsets in Afghanistan. The similarity triggered memories that therapy had helped her manage but never completely eliminate, adding emotional pressure to the anxiety about tonight's VFW meeting. Yes. Walking home to prepare for the evening that would define her future in Fox Hollow, Andy understood that some decisions couldn't be delayed indefinitely. The intersection of official interest, community curiosity, and her own need for authentic relationships had created circumstances that demanded honesty about experiences she'd hoped to keep private. Tonight, she would either find a way to maintain her carefully constructed anonymity or begin the process of revealing truths that would change how everyone in Fox Hollow understood the scarred woman they'd accepted as a quiet contributor to their community's welfare. Fox Hollow VFW Post 847 occupied a converted warehouse on the edge of town, its brick exterior bearing decades of Texas weather and the kind of honest wear that spoke of genuine community use. Andy Wells approached the building through parking lot gravel that crunched beneath her feet like distant gunfire, each step requiring conscious effort to overcome anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Through tall windows, she could see veterans already gathered inside, their silhouettes moving between folding chairs and long tables that had hosted countless meetings about everything from fundraising drives to memorial services. The warm light spilling from the building represented the kind of community belonging she'd observed from a distance but never fully experienced since leaving the Navy. Andy paused at the entrance, her scarred hand resting on the door handle while she summoned courage to face scrutiny that could expose everything she'd worked to protect. The button-down shirt she'd chosen covered her arms completely, hiding not just the shrapnel damage, but also the Navy Cross tattoo that represented the most classified and painful period of her military career. Inside, the VFW post buzzed with conversations that died momentarily when members noticed her entrance. Andy recognized faces from around Fox Hollow, men and women whose military service had earned them membership in a community that valued shared sacrifice above civilian achievements. Their expressions ranged from curious to welcoming, though she noted several veterans studying her appearance with the kind of analytical attention that suggested professional interest in her obvious combat injuries. Colonel Frank Montgomery stood near a podium at the front of the room, shuffling papers while conducting quiet conversations with other post officers. His bearing commanded attention from everyone present, but when his eyes settled on Andy, his expression carried skepticism that bordered on hostility. "Miss Wells," Montgomery called out, his voice cutting through the general conversations. "Glad you could make it. We saved you a seat up front." The invitation felt more like a command, directing Andy toward chairs that would make her visible to every person in the room. She recognized the tactical positioning as deliberate, designed to maximize scrutiny while minimizing her ability to observe others' reactions without being noticed herself. Walt Gibson approached with the slow dignity of advanced age, his weathered face carrying genuine warmth that contrasted with Montgomery's authoritative coldness. Captain Wells, we appreciate your willingness to help with community health services. Your medical background could make a real difference for folks who can't afford regular health care. The use of her military rank caused several heads to turn, as veterans throughout the room registered that the scarred woman they'd been curious about actually outranked many of them. Andy felt the shift in attention that came with rank recognition, though she wasn't certain whether the change represented increased respect or intensified suspicion about her background. Bobby Ray Tucker moved toward them with the confident stride of someone comfortable in military environments, despite visible injuries from his own combat service. His left sleeve was pinned up where his arm ended below the elbow, but he carried himself without self-consciousness about damage that had redefined his post-military identity. "Captain, I've been looking forward to meeting you," Bobby Ray said, extending his right hand for a handshake that Andy accepted gratefully. "Dr. Adams says you've got trauma medicine experience that could help train younger veterans in emergency response." Andy nodded, appreciating his directness about military credentials while avoiding questions about specific operational experience. "I'd be happy to help with basic emergency medical training. Combat veterans already understand working under pressure, so the transition to civilian emergency response usually comes naturally." "That's exactly what we need," Bobby Ray replied, then lowered his voice slightly. "Frank's been asking questions about your service record. Might want to be prepared for some direct inquiries about your background." The warning confirmed Andy's suspicions about Montgomery's intentions for tonight's meeting. Rather than focusing solely on community service planning, he was clearly interested in conducting what amounted to an unofficial interrogation about her military qualifications and operational experience. Norma Jean Butler entered the post carrying a coffee pot and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested she had opinions about how the evening should proceed. Her presence immediately improved the atmosphere, as several veterans called out greetings that reflected genuine affection for someone who'd supported their community through decades of service. "Evening, everyone," Norma Jean announced, beginning to pour coffee for members who'd learned to appreciate her attention to their comfort. "I brought fresh cookies from the church bake sale, so make sure you save room after we finish business." Her arrival provided Andy with a momentary reprieve from direct scrutiny, as attention shifted towards someone whose contributions to the veteran community were both visible and long established. Norma Jean's support could prove crucial if Montgomery's questioning became overly aggressive. Mayor Phil Barnes appeared in the doorway with the slightly hurried appearance of someone juggling multiple evening commitments. His presence at a VFW meeting wasn't unusual, as community leaders often attended veteran gatherings to maintain relationships with an influential voting bloc, but his timing suggested he'd been specifically invited for tonight's agenda. "Sorry I'm late, folks," Barnes called out, accepting coffee from Norma Jean while scanning the room to identify faces he recognized. His eyes settled on Andy with the kind of polite interest that politicians maintained for all constituents, though his expression suggested he'd been briefed about her growing prominence in community discussions. Montgomery called the meeting to order with authority that immediately focused everyone's attention toward the front of the room. "Tonight we're discussing the community health fair and reviewing volunteers who'll be providing medical services to Fox Hollow residents." Andy felt her pulse quicken as Montgomery's introduction made clear that her qualifications would be central to the evening's agenda. The assembled veterans represented decades of military experience that could evaluate her background with accuracy that civilian employers would never possess. "Before we discuss specific assignments," Montgomery continued, "I think it's important that we understand the qualifications of people who'll be representing our post in the community. Miss Wells, would you mind telling us about your military medical training?" The question was phrased politely, but its placement at the beginning of official business suggested that Montgomery considered her background verification more important than actual health fair planning. Andy recognized the interrogation dynamic that was being established, with herself as the subject of community scrutiny. "I served as a Navy medical specialist with training in trauma response and emergency medicine," she replied, choosing words that were accurate but didn't reveal the classified nature of her actual operational assignments. "Navy medical specialist covers a lot of different jobs," Montgomery observed, consulting notes that suggested he'd done research about naval medical classifications. "Were you assigned to ships, shore installations, or operational units?" The question probed toward information that Andy preferred not to discuss publicly, as her assignments had involved classified operations that couldn't be detailed even in veteran community settings. Her hesitation before responding was noted by several members who understood that evasive answers usually indicated either classified service or experiences too traumatic for casual discussion. "Mixed assignments," she said finally. "Different facilities and operational requirements depending on where medical support was needed." Montgomery's expression suggested that her evasive response confirmed his suspicions about inconsistencies in her background story. "And where did you serve geographically?" Deployment locations can help us understand what kind of medical situations you encountered. Andy felt trapped between honest disclosure and protection of classified information, knowing that any answer she provided would either satisfy Montgomery's curiosity or raise additional questions about why she was reluctant to discuss standard military service details. "Overseas deployments in support of fleet operations," she replied, maintaining the same level of generality that had characterized her previous responses. "Fleet operations in what theaters?" Montgomery pressed, his tone growing more authoritative as Andy's evasions continued. "Afghanistan, Iraq, Horn of Africa." "Pacific operations." The specific mention of Afghanistan sent tension through Andy's chest, as memories of Helmand Province threatened to overwhelm the careful emotional control she'd maintained since entering the VFW post. Several veterans in the room were studying her reaction with the kind of professional attention that suggested they recognized signs of combat-related trauma. "Multiple theaters," she managed, though her voice carried strain that wasn't lost on anyone present. Walt Gibson intervened with the gentle authority that came from decades of community leadership. "Frank, maybe we should focus on Captain Wells. Current qualifications rather than detailed deployment history. Her medical skills are what matter for community health services." "Walt, we need to understand who we're endorsing to represent our post," Montgomery replied, though he moderated his tone slightly in response to Gibson's implied criticism. "Military medical specialists have different levels of training depending on their assignments and operational experience." Bobby Ray Tucker stood slowly, his visible combat injuries lending weight to his words. "Colonel Montgomery, with respect, Captain Wells, willingness to help our community should matter more than satisfying curiosity about her service record. Combat veterans understand that some experiences are difficult to discuss publicly." The intervention created a division within the room that Andy hadn't intended, but couldn't prevent. Younger veterans seemed supportive of her privacy needs, while Montgomery's generation appeared to expect more detailed explanations about military service that previous generations had discussed more openly. "This isn't about curiosity," Montgomery responded, his voice taking on an edge that suggested Bobby Ray's challenge had struck a nerve. "This is about ensuring that people representing our post have the qualifications they claim to possess." The accusation of false credentials hit Andy like a physical blow, though she recognized that Montgomery's skepticism was based on her reluctance to provide details that would satisfy his investigation rather than any evidence of dishonesty. His military experience had taught him to distrust evasive answers, but he lacked clearances to access the classified records that would explain her reluctance to discuss her operational service. "Colonel Montgomery," Andy said quietly, summoning courage to address his challenge directly, "my qualifications speak for themselves through my current work at Fox Hollow General Hospital. Dr. Adams and the medical staff can verify my capabilities without requiring detailed discussion of classified military assignments." The mention of classified assignments caused a ripple of understanding through veterans who recognized the term's implications. Classified service explained evasive answers while suggesting qualifications that exceeded normal military medical training. "Classified assignments," Montgomery repeated, his tone carrying skepticism that bordered on mockery. "That's a convenient explanation for avoiding questions about basic military service details." Andy felt anger building alongside anxiety as Montgomery's challenges grew more personal and dismissive. His obvious disbelief in her claims about classified service touched on experiences that had cost her career, her health, and nearly her life in service to missions that had protected American interests throughout the Middle East. "Colonel Montgomery," she said, her voice carrying steel that several veterans recognized as combat-tested authority, "some military service involves operations that can't be discussed in public forums, regardless of the audience's security clearances or curiosity levels." Montgomery's expression hardened at what he interpreted as insubordination from someone he considered questionably qualified for the respect she was demanding. "Miss Wells, I've served 30 years in the Army, including multiple combat deployments and classified assignments of my own. I think I can evaluate military service claims with appropriate discretion. The confrontation had escalated beyond health fair planning into a direct challenge about military credentials that neither participant could resolve without revealing information they preferred to protect. Andy realized that Montgomery's skepticism was forcing exactly the kind of exposure she'd hoped to avoid, while Montgomery felt that his authority as post commander was being challenged by someone whose background didn't support her apparent claims to classified service. Perhaps, Andy said slowly, understanding that the evening had reached a point where continued evasion would only intensify suspicions about her honesty. We should discuss this privately rather than making it a public issue. No, Montgomery replied firmly, his command voice carrying through the room. If you're going to represent our post in community service, these qualifications need to be verified publicly. We're not accepting classified service claims without some kind of documentation that supports extraordinary background claims. Andy felt the room's attention focusing on her with uncomfortable intensity as Montgomery's challenge demanded a response that would either satisfy his skepticism or expose her to exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd spent 3 years avoiding. The veteran community's support depended on honesty about military service. But honesty about her service would change everything about her carefully constructed life in Fox Hollow. Standing before people who'd become her community, Andy realized that her time of hiding was ending whether she chose disclosure or continued evasion. Montgomery's public challenge had created circumstances where her response would define her future relationships with everyone present, and potentially everyone in Fox Hollow who would hear about tonight's confrontation. The room waited in tense silence as she prepared to make a choice that would either protect her privacy at the cost of community acceptance, or reveal truths that would change how everyone understood the scarred woman they'd been judging, based on appearances rather than achievements. The silence in Fox Hollow VFW Post 847 stretched like a held breath as Andy Wells faced Colonel Montgomery's public challenge about her military credentials. Every veteran in the room understood that the next few moments would determine not just her place in their community, but the validity of service claims that Montgomery had essentially accused her of fabricating. Andy's scarred hands trembled slightly as she weighed options that had narrowed to 2 impossible choices: continue protecting her privacy at the cost of her reputation, or expose the most painful period of her life to people who might not understand the full cost of the heroism they would witness. "Colonel Montgomery," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that several combat veterans recognized as someone fighting internal battles while addressing external challenges. "You want documentation of my classified service." Montgomery crossed his arms, his bearing radiating skepticism that had hardened into open disbelief. "I want honest answers about military service that you've been evading since the day you arrived in Fox Hollow. This community deserves better than convenient excuses about classified operations that can't be verified." The accusation of dishonesty hit Andy like shrapnel, tearing through emotional defenses she'd built during 3 years of careful anonymity. She looked around the room at faces that had become familiar through months of community interaction, recognizing that Montgomery's public challenge had poisoned relationships she'd hoped to preserve through continued privacy. Bobby Ray Tucker shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his visible combat injuries lending authority to his obvious disagreement with Montgomery's interrogation tactics. "Colonel, maybe we should handle this privately rather than putting Captain Wells through a public examination about service that might be legitimately classified." "There's nothing private about representing our post in community service," Montgomery replied sharply. "If Miss Wells wants our endorsement for the health fair, she needs to provide credible evidence that her claimed qualifications are genuine rather than fabricated for personal advantage." The suggestion that she was seeking personal advantage through false military credentials pushed Andy past the breaking point, where self-protection mattered more than community acceptance. She'd endured months of curious stares and whispered speculation about her scars, but having her integrity challenged by someone who'd never risked anything approaching her level of sacrifice triggered anger that overwhelmed her careful emotional control. "You want evidence of my service?" Andy asked, her voice carrying steel that made every veteran in the room pay attention. "You want proof that my qualifications are genuine rather than fabricated?" Montgomery's expression suggested he expected her to produce paperwork or contact information that would allow verification of claims he considered increasingly dubious. "That's exactly what I want. Documentation that supports extraordinary service claims." Andy reached for the buttons of her shirt with movements that were deliberate but clearly difficult for her. The room's attention focused with uncomfortable intensity as she began revealing scarring that had been hidden beneath professional clothing during all their previous encounters. "This is my documentation," she said, pulling her shirt off her left shoulder to expose damage that made several veterans involuntarily gasp. The shrapnel scarring was far more extensive than anyone had realized, covering her entire shoulder and upper arm in patterns that spoke of proximity to explosive devices under combat conditions. But it was the tattoo positioned prominently on her shoulder that caused the room to fall into absolute silence. The Navy Cross design was unmistakable to anyone familiar with military decorations. An eagle perched on an anchor, surrounded by 13 stars that represented the second highest award for valor that the United States Navy could bestow. Walt Gibson was the first to find his voice, though his words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sweet Jesus, that's a Navy Cross." Montgomery's face had gone pale as he stared at a tattoo that represented recognition he'd never achieved despite 30 years of military service. The Navy Cross was awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat situations, placing its recipients among the most elite warriors in American military history. "Holy God," Bobby Ray breathed, recognizing both the decoration and its implications. "Captain, how many people did you save?" Andy's hands shook as she pulled her shirt back into position, the exposure having cost more emotional energy than she'd anticipated. 11 Marines. Helicopter crash in Helmand Province, October 15th, 3 years ago. The specific details hit several veterans like recognition lightning, as combat deployments had taught them to remember significant incidents that affected American forces throughout the Middle East. News of helicopter crews and passengers being rescued from burning aircraft traveled through military networks even when operational details remained classified. Norma Jean Butler had tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of what Montgomery's skepticism had forced Andy to reveal. "Honey, you went into a burning helicopter 11 times?" 6 times, Andy corrected quietly, her voice carrying the flat emotional tone that trauma survivors used when discussing experiences too painful for normal inflection. "Multiple casualties per trip. The helicopter was taking fire from insurgent positions while the fuel system was compromised and burning." Mayor Barnes had gone completely silent, recognizing that he was witnessing the exposure of heroism that redefined everything about Fox Hollow's understanding of one of their community members. The woman they'd seen as damaged goods was actually one of the most decorated heroes in recent naval history. Montgomery stood frozen, comprehension dawning that his public challenge had forced disclosure of service that exceeded anything in his own military background. The Navy Cross represented valor that most career officers never approached, earned through actions that had clearly cost Andy her health and her career. "Captain Wells," he said slowly, his voice carrying shock rather than the authority that had characterized his earlier challenges. "I had no idea." "No idea about what?" Andy asked, her tone carrying bitter exhaustion that spoke of years spent hiding achievements that should have been sources of pride. "No idea that the scarred woman working at Palmer's Diner was actually qualified for community medical service. No idea that someone with obvious combat injuries might have earned them through heroic actions rather than careless accidents." The questions struck Montgomery like accusations he couldn't defend against, forcing him to confront the prejudices that had shaped his treatment of someone whose service record dwarfed his own achievements. His skepticism had been based on appearances rather than investigation, assumption rather than evidence. Bobby Ray Tucker attempted to fill the uncomfortable silence that followed Andy's challenge. "Captain, the Navy Cross is presented by the Secretary of the Navy. The citation would have been signed by the President. How long were you hospitalized after the rescue?" 14 months, Andy replied, her scarred hands unconsciously moving toward her left arm where the most severe shrapnel damage remained visible. "Walter Reed Medical Center. Multiple surgeries to rebuild damaged muscle and bone structure. Medical retirement when it became clear that my injuries were too extensive for continued active duty." The timeline painted a picture of sacrifice that went far beyond the initial heroic actions, encompassing years of medical treatment and rehabilitation that had ended her naval career while she was still young enough to serve for decades. Her transition to civilian employment hadn't been chosen retirement, but medical necessity imposed by injuries sustained saving other people's lives. Walt Gibson stood slowly, his advanced age making the movement difficult, but his expression showing the kind of respect that transcended generational differences. When he reached Andy's position, he executed a precise military salute that brought several other veterans to their feet in similar recognition. "Captain Wells," Gibson said formally, maintaining his salute until Andy awkwardly returned it, "Fox Hollow is honored to have you in our community." The gesture created a cascade of recognition throughout the room as other veterans stood and saluted someone whose service had earned respect that few of them could claim. Even younger veterans who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan recognized that Andy's actions represented heroism that exceeded normal combat experience. Montgomery remained seated, his face reflecting the kind of internal struggle that came from realizing he'd publicly humiliated himself through ignorance and prejudice. His challenge to Andy's credentials had exposed his own limitations as a leader and his failure to recognize genuine heroism when it was standing directly in front of him. "Colonel Montgomery," Andy said quietly, her voice carrying exhaustion rather than triumph, "I never wanted recognition or special treatment. I just wanted to serve this community quietly, using skills I developed during military service to help people who needed medical care." The statement highlighted the contrast between Andy's desire for anonymous service and Montgomery's demand for public validation of credentials. Her approach to community contribution had been humble and effective, while his interrogation had been driven by authority and suspicion that proved completely unfounded. "Captain," Montgomery said, finally struggling to find words that could address the magnitude of his error, "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure how to make. You owe me the same respect you'd give any veteran whose service you hadn't bothered to investigate before challenging their integrity," Andy replied, her tone carrying disappointment rather than anger. "The same assumption of good faith that you'd want if someone questioned your credentials based on incomplete information." The rebuke was delivered gently, but it struck Montgomery with force that made clear how thoroughly his leadership had failed during the evening's proceedings. He'd allowed skepticism to override judgment, prejudice to replace investigation, and authority to substitute for wisdom. Reverend Matt Fisher entered the VFW post with timing that suggested he'd been monitoring the situation from outside, waiting for an appropriate moment to provide pastoral support for whatever crisis was developing inside. His expression immediately registered the tension that filled the room and the emotional exhaustion that marked Andy's posture. "Is everything all right in here?" Reverend Fisher asked, though his tone suggested he understood that significant events had occurred during his absence. "Everything's fine, Reverend," Andy said, though her voice carried strain that contradicted her words. "Just clarifying some misunderstandings about my military background." Norma Jean Butler approached Reverend Fisher with updates delivered in whispers that conveyed the essential details about Andy's revealed heroism and Montgomery's public embarrassment. The minister's expression shifted from concern to amazement as he processed information about the Navy Cross and the circumstances that had earned it. "Captain Wells," Reverend Fisher said after receiving Norma Jean's briefing, "I had no idea we were blessed with someone of your caliber in our community. Your willingness to serve others, both during military deployment and here in Fox Hollow, represents the kind of selfless dedication that inspires everyone around you." Andy accepted his praise with obvious discomfort, her body language suggesting that recognition felt more burdensome than rewarding. 3 years of anonymity had provided psychological protection that exposure was now eliminating, leaving her vulnerable to attention she'd specifically tried to avoid. "Reverend, I appreciate your kind words, but I'm still the same person who's been working at Palmer's Diner and the hospital," she said, attempting to minimize the significance of revelations that had fundamentally changed how everyone present understood her identity and qualifications. "That's exactly right," Mayor Barnes said, speaking for the first time since Andy's tattoo revelation. "You're the same person, but now we understand that we've been fortunate to have someone of extraordinary capabilities contributing to our community without seeking recognition or special treatment." His observation highlighted what several veterans had been thinking, that Andy's approach to civilian service reflected the same selfless dedication that had earned her military decoration. Rather than trading on her heroic background for personal advantage, she'd chosen an anonymous contribution that benefited others without calling attention to her own achievements. Montgomery finally stood, his military bearing restored, but his expression carrying humility that had been absent during his earlier challenges to Andy's credibility. "Captain Wells, I was wrong to question your service without proper investigation. I was wrong to demand public validation of credentials that I should have accepted with the same professional courtesy I'd want from my own background." Andy nodded acknowledgement of his apology while maintaining the emotional distance that suggested forgiveness would require time and genuine changed behavior rather than words alone. Montgomery's recognition of error was necessary but insufficient to repair damage caused by his public skepticism. "Colonel Montgomery," she said carefully, "military leadership requires trusting subordinates until evidence suggests that trust is misplaced. Tonight, you chose suspicion over trust, interrogation over respect. That reflects leadership principles that could damage this post's ability to support veterans who need community acceptance rather than investigation." The criticism was delivered professionally but struck Montgomery with accuracy that made clear how thoroughly his approach had violated military leadership standards. He'd failed to support a fellow veteran, damaged community cohesion, and exposed his own limitations as a leader worthy of the respect his rank normally commanded. As the evening's formal meeting concluded with health fair assignments that no longer seemed important after the personal dramas that had dominated the proceedings, Andy prepared to leave the VFW post, understanding that her life in Fox Hollow had been permanently changed by Montgomery's forced exposure of her military background. The community now knew they were living alongside genuine heroism rather than simply tolerating visible damage, but Andy wasn't certain whether that knowledge would improve or complicate the relationships she'd spent 3 years carefully building. The parking lot of Fox Hollow VFW Post 847 felt different under the October stars as Andy Wells stepped into cool air that carried the scent of approaching autumn. Behind her, muted conversations continued through windows that cast rectangular patches of warm light across gravel where she'd stood just hours earlier, dreading the scrutiny that had ultimately forced her most carefully guarded secrets into public view. Her hands still trembled from the emotional cost of revealing the Navy Cross tattoo, each finger betraying stress that she couldn't control despite years of therapy designed to help combat veterans manage trauma responses. The physical reaction felt familiar yet unwelcome, a reminder that some aspects of military service never fully healed regardless of time or treatment. Sheriff Carl Patterson emerged from the VFW post with the measured pace of someone processing significant new information about a community member he'd thought he understood. His uniform shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, suggesting the evening's revelations had affected him more deeply than his professional demeanor typically allowed. "Captain Wells," Patterson called softly, approaching with obvious respect for someone whose military service had exceeded anything in his own background. "Mind if I walk with you for a few minutes?" Andy paused beside her aging Honda Civic, recognizing that Patterson's request represented more than casual conversation. His tone carried the weight of official interest mixed with personal concern, suggesting that her revealed background had implications extending beyond community curiosity. "Of course, Sheriff," she replied, though her body language suggested wariness about additional scrutiny from local authorities who now possessed information that could complicate her carefully constructed civilian life. Patterson fell into step beside her as they walked toward Fox Hollow's main street, where streetlights illuminated empty storefronts that had anchored the town's economy for decades. Their footsteps echoed off pavement that had absorbed countless similar conversations between community members, processing unexpected revelations. "That was quite a revelation in there," Patterson said carefully, choosing words that acknowledged the significance of what he'd witnessed without pressing for additional details. "I don't think anyone expected to discover we had a Navy Cross recipient working quietly in our community." Andy kept her eyes focused ahead, uncomfortable with attention that felt simultaneously validating and intrusive. "I never intended for my military background to become public knowledge. Some experiences are easier to process privately rather than as community topics of discussion." Patterson nodded understanding, his own veteran status providing insight into the psychological complexities that accompanied combat recognition. Military decorations carry weight that extends beyond the actions that earned them. Sometimes that recognition becomes harder to bear than the original trauma. His observations struck close to emotional truths that Andy had been wrestling with since her medical retirement from the Navy. The Navy Cross represented both her greatest achievement and her deepest loss, marking the end of a military identity that had defined her purpose and direction throughout her adult life. "Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but I'm still processing tonight's events myself," Andy said, stopping beside the darkened windows of Jenkins' hardware store, where community bulletin boards displayed announcements for church socials and high school sporting events. "Having my military service exposed wasn't something I was prepared for." "I understand that," Patterson replied, settling against the storefront with the casual bearing of someone who understood the value of unhurried conversation. "But Andy, you need to understand that this information changes how people in Fox Hollow see you and, more importantly, how they see their own community." The comment touched on implications that Andy hadn't fully considered during her years of maintaining anonymity. Her presence in Fox Hollow wasn't just about her own recovery and civilian transition. It also represented the kind of heroic service that small communities took pride in claiming as their own. "How so?" she asked, though she suspected Patterson's answer would involve exactly the kind of recognition she'd been trying to avoid. "Fox Hollow's always been proud of our veterans, but we've never had someone with your level of recognition living among us," Patterson explained, his tone carrying civic pride mixed with protective concern. "Word's going to spread beyond tonight's meeting, and that means attention from outside our community." The prospect of broader attention sent anxiety through Andy's chest, as media interest or veteran organization recognition could expose her to exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd relocated to Fox Hollow to escape. Her story had been documented in military history publications, but her identity had remained protected through classification protocols that civilian journalists might not respect. "What kind of attention?" Andy asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer. Navy Cross recipients are rare enough that military historians track their stories, especially when they involve classified operations that get declassified over time, Patterson said, consulting knowledge he'd acquired through his own veteran networks. "Your rescue in Helmand Province probably already exists in official records that could be matched to your identity if someone with appropriate resources decided to investigate." The revelation that her story was potentially traceable through military records confirmed Andy's worst fears about the sustainability of her anonymity. If determined researchers could connect her current location to her military service, the quiet life she'd built in Fox Hollow could be compromised by attention she was psychologically unprepared to handle. Cameron Mills appeared around the corner of Jenkins' hardware store with the sudden energy that characterized teenage movement, though his expression carried unusual seriousness for someone typically bubbling with enthusiasm about community events. "Miss Andy," Cameron called out, his voice mixing excitement with concern as he approached their impromptu sidewalk conference. "Mom sent me to find you. She heard about what happened at the VFW meeting and wanted to make sure you were okay." The teenager's presence provided unexpected emotional support during a moment when Andy felt particularly vulnerable to the kind of overwhelming attention that could trigger anxiety responses. Cameron's consistent friendship had become one of her most valued relationships in Fox Hollow, representing acceptance that wasn't based on military achievement or pity for visible injuries. "I'm fine, Cameron," Andy said, though her voice carried strain that contradicted her words. "Just processing a difficult evening." Cameron studied her expression with the kind of perceptive attention that had consistently impressed the adults in his life. "Miss Andy, is it true what people are saying about you being a real military hero? About saving all those Marines from a helicopter crash?" The question came from genuine curiosity rather than sensation-seeking, but it forced Andy to confront the reality that her story was already spreading through Fox Hollow's interconnected social networks. Within hours, everyone in town would know that the scarred woman from Palmer's Diner was actually one of the most decorated veterans in recent military history. "It's true that I served in the Navy, and that my service included some difficult situations," Andy replied carefully, maintaining the measured tone that had become her standard response to questions about her military background. "But you saved 11 people by going into a burning helicopter while people were shooting at you," Cameron pressed gently, his tone carrying awe rather than invasive curiosity. "That's not just some difficult situation. That's like superhero stuff." Sheriff Patterson smiled at Cameron's assessment, recognizing the teenager's ability to cut through adult complexity to identify essential truths. "Cameron's got a point, Andy. What you did transcends normal military service and enters territory that most people only read about in history books." Andy felt overwhelmed by their combined attention and praise, emotions that therapy had taught her to recognize as symptoms of her ongoing struggle to accept recognition for actions that had cost her so much personally. The Navy Cross represented both heroism and loss, achievement and trauma, pride and devastating change to her life trajectory. "Cameron, Sheriff Patterson, I appreciate your support, but I need some time to process tonight's events before I can discuss their implications," she said, moving toward her car with obvious intention to end the conversation. "Of course," Patterson replied, stepping aside to allow her passage while maintaining his protective posture. But Andy, if you need any support dealing with attention that might come from outside Fox Hollow, the county has resources that can help veterans manage media interest or unwanted scrutiny. His offer represented the kind of community support that had made Fox Hollow feel like home, though Andy wasn't certain whether local resources could protect her from the kind of national attention that Navy Cross recipients sometimes attracted when their stories became public knowledge. "Thank you," she said, settling behind the wheel of her Honda while Cameron approached the driver's side window with obvious reluctance to let their conversation end. "Miss Andy," Cameron said quietly, his voice carrying maturity that exceeded his 17 years. "I know tonight was hard for you, but I want you to know that learning about your military service makes me even more proud to call you my friend." The teenager's words hit Andy with unexpected emotional force, representing exactly the kind of authentic relationship she'd hoped to build in Fox Hollow. Cameron's acceptance wasn't based on pity for her injuries or awe at her military achievements. It was grounded in consistent personal interaction that had revealed her character rather than her credentials. "Thank you, Cameron," she managed, though her voice broke slightly with emotion that she couldn't completely control. "Your friendship has meant more to me than you probably realize." Driving through Fox Hollow's quiet streets toward her apartment above Webb's Auto Repair, Andy processed the evening's events through psychological frameworks that therapy had provided for managing overwhelming experiences. The forced revelation of her Navy Cross service represented a fundamental change to her civilian identity that would require significant adjustment to her daily routines and social relationships. Her apartment felt smaller when she climbed the stairs that led to living space she'd furnished with minimalist efficiency rather than emotional comfort. The sparse decorations and functional furniture reflected someone who'd been prepared to relocate quickly if her anonymity became compromised, though tonight's events suggested that preparation might prove insufficient for managing the attention that could follow her exposure. Andy settled at her small table with coffee that provided familiar comfort, while her mind raced through implications of Montgomery's forced disclosure. The VFW meeting had ended her 3-year experiment in anonymous civilian service, replacing carefully maintained privacy with community recognition that felt simultaneously validating and terrifying. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Adams. "Heard about tonight's meeting. Whatever you need for support, the hospital staff is behind you 100%. The message was followed by another from Garrett Webb. "Proud to have been your friend before tonight and even prouder now. Nothing changes between us." Additional messages arrived from Norma Jean Butler, Reverend Fisher, and several other Fox Hollow residents whose support suggested that her revealed military background was being received with respect rather than uncomfortable curiosity. The community response felt overwhelmingly positive, though Andy remained anxious about attention that might extend beyond local acceptance. Her reflection was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs leading to her apartment, followed by a gentle knock that suggested someone seeking conversation rather than demanding immediate attention. Andy approached the door with caution that had become automatic during her years of maintaining privacy about her background. "Andy?" Garrett Webb's voice carried through the door. "I brought coffee and cookies from Norma Jean's batch at the VFW. Thought you might want some company while you process tonight's events." His offer represented exactly the kind of low-key support that Andy needed during a moment when she felt emotionally fragile from forced exposure of her most carefully guarded experiences. Garrett's consistent friendship had been based on who she was rather than what she'd achieved, making him one of the few people whose reaction to her military background felt completely trustworthy. "Come in," she called, opening the door to admit someone whose presence would provide comfort without pressure to discuss topics she wasn't ready to address publicly. Garrett entered with coffee cups and a paper bag that filled her small apartment with the aroma of fresh baking, his expression carrying concern mixed with respect for someone whose military service had exceeded his previous understanding. His manner remained warm and familiar despite revelations that had transformed how everyone in Fox Hollow understood her background. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling coffee and cookies on her table while maintaining the casual demeanor that had characterized their friendship since her arrival in Fox Hollow. Overwhelmed, Andy admitted, accepting coffee that provided both physical comfort and symbolic normalcy during a day that had fundamentally changed her relationship with the community. 3 years of privacy gone in one evening because Montgomery couldn't accept that some veterans prefer quiet service over public recognition. Garrett nodded, understanding, while studying her expression with the kind of protective attention that suggested he was evaluating her emotional state for signs of serious distress. "Andy, tonight's revelation doesn't change who you are or how people who really know you feel about your friendship." His assurance touched on fears that Andy hadn't fully articulated. That disclosure of her military background might change relationships that had been based on civilian interaction rather than veteran recognition. The people she'd grown closest to in Fox Hollow had accepted her as a scarred woman seeking quiet contribution rather than a decorated hero deserving special treatment. "How do you know that?" she asked, voicing anxieties that therapy had taught her to express rather than suppress. "Because the person who makes incredible hash browns at Palmer's Diner, who saves lives at the hospital, who treats Cameron like family, and who fixed my truck's electrical system when no one else could figure it out, that person is exactly the same as the Navy Cross recipient who saved 11 Marines in Afghanistan," Garrett said, his tone carrying conviction that helped calm her racing thoughts. "Your military service explains your capabilities, but it doesn't change your character." His perspective offered a framework for understanding how her revealed background might integrate with, rather than replace, the civilian identity she developed in Fox Hollow. The heroism that had earned her military recognition was consistent with the service-oriented approach she'd brought to her civilian employment and community relationships. "What happens now?" Andy asked, though she suspected Garrett's answer couldn't address her deepest concerns about managing attention that might extend beyond Fox Hollow's supportive community boundaries. "Now you continue being the person you've always been, with the added confidence that comes from knowing your community understands and appreciates the full extent of your capabilities," he replied, offering cookies that represented normalcy amid circumstances that felt anything but normal. As they sat together in her small apartment processing an evening that had changed everything about Andy's relationship with Fox Hollow, she began to understand that some secrets were too heavy to carry indefinitely, and that sharing painful truths with trustworthy people might actually strengthen rather than compromise the relationships she'd worked so hard to protect. Word traveled through Fox Hollow with the speed that small towns reserved for truly significant news, carried by phone calls that stretched past midnight and early breakfast conversations that buzzed with excitement about the decorated hero who'd been living quietly among them. By dawn, Andy Wells discovered that her carefully maintained anonymity had been replaced by community recognition that felt both overwhelming and oddly liberating. Palmer's Diner filled earlier than usual as residents arrived seeking first-hand glimpses of the woman whose military service had exceeded their wildest assumptions about the scarred cook they'd grown accustomed to seeing behind the grill. Andy felt their stares with uncomfortable intensity, though the expressions carried awe and respect rather than the pity she'd endured during her first years in Fox Hollow. Judy Palmer emerged from her office with coffee receipts and a bemused expression that suggested she was still processing revelations about her most competent employee. "Andy, honey, my phone started ringing at 5:30 this morning. Seems like half the county wants to know if it's true about you being a Navy Cross recipient." Andy flipped pancakes with movements that remained steady despite emotional turbulence that felt like standing in surf that kept knocking her off balance. "Word spreads fast in small towns." "This isn't just small-town gossip," Judy replied, settling beside the coffee station where she could observe both Andy's work and the unusual crowd that had gathered for breakfast. "Mrs. Henderson from the Methodist Church called to ask if you'd be willing to speak at their Veterans Day service. The Rotary Club wants to present you with some kind of community service award. And the high school principal is hoping you might visit Cameron's history class to discuss military service." Each request represented exactly the kind of public attention that Andy had relocated to Fox Hollow to avoid, though she recognized that refusing community recognition might seem ungrateful to people who were genuinely excited about claiming her heroism as part of their town's identity. "I appreciate their interest," Andy said carefully, "but I'm not comfortable with public speaking about military service that involved classified operations." Dr. Michelle Adams pushed through the diner's front door with the hurried stride of someone managing multiple morning emergencies, her white coat bearing fresh coffee stains that suggested an already challenging day. Her expression brightened when she spotted Andy at the grill, though concern mixed with obvious respect in her assessment of her colleague's emotional state. "Andy, how are you holding up?" Dr. Adams asked, settling onto her usual counter stool while accepting coffee that Judy poured automatically. "The hospital's been fielding calls since 6 a.m. from people wanting to verify that we really have a Navy Cross recipient working in our emergency department." The revelation that Andy's military background was attracting attention beyond Fox Hollow's community boundaries confirmed her worst fears about the sustainability of the quiet life she'd tried to build. Medical facilities often attracted scrutiny from regulatory agencies and professional organizations that could expose her to exactly the kind of institutional attention she was psychologically unprepared to handle. "What kind of calls?" Andy asked, though she suspected the answers would involve complications that extended far beyond community curiosity. "Regional medical directors wanting to understand how we recruited someone with your qualifications for a small-town hospital position," Dr. Adams explained, stirring sugar into coffee while studying Andy's reaction with professional concern. "The state nursing board called to verify your certifications and ask about advanced trauma training that isn't reflected in your official employment application." Andy felt familiar anxiety building as institutional scrutiny threatened to expose inconsistencies between her documented qualifications and her actual capabilities. Her medical skills exceeded her civilian credentials because of military training that she'd deliberately omitted from employment applications designed to secure quiet positions rather than prestigious appointments. "Dr. Adams, my qualifications for hospital work are exactly what they've always been," Andy said, hoping to deflect investigation that could reveal the classified nature of her naval medical training. "Nothing about last night's revelations changes my current job performance or certification status." "I understand that," Dr. Adams replied gently, "but Andy, your trauma medicine capabilities suggest training that goes far beyond standard Navy medical specialist programs. The procedures you performed during that multi-vehicle accident would have impressed surgeons at major metropolitan trauma centers." Before Andy could respond, Linda Mills entered Palmer's diner with Cameron trailing behind her, both carrying expressions that suggested they'd been engaged in serious conversation during their drive into town. Linda's demeanor had changed dramatically since learning about Andy's military service, replacing suspicious wariness with obvious respect for someone whose heroism had redefined her understanding of the scarred woman her son had befriended. "Miss Wells," Linda said formally, approaching the counter with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was struggling to find appropriate words for addressing someone she'd previously treated with barely concealed prejudice. "Cameron insisted that we come speak with you this morning." Andy continued working at the grill while processing the uncomfortable reality that her relationship with Linda Mills would now be complicated by recognition that made her previous rudeness seem particularly inappropriate. Military decorations carried social weight that could transform dynamics in ways that felt artificial rather than genuine. "What can I help you with, Mrs. Mills?" Andy asked, maintaining the polite tone that had characterized their limited previous interactions. "I owe you an apology," Linda said, her voice carrying embarrassment that was painful to witness. "My behavior toward you has been inexcusable, based on appearances rather than character, and I'm deeply ashamed of how I've treated someone who served our country with such distinction." The apology felt sincere, but also highlighted the problematic nature of recognition based on military achievement rather than civilian conduct. Andy had been the same person before and after revealing her Navy Cross service, yet Linda's treatment had changed completely based on information that shouldn't have been necessary for basic human respect. "Mrs. Mills, I appreciate your apology, but I hope you understand that military service doesn't make someone more deserving of courtesy than they were before their background became known," Andy said, delivering gentle criticism that nevertheless made clear how Linda's prejudice had affected their relationship. Cameron stepped forward with the earnest expression that had made him one of Andy's most valued relationships in Fox Hollow. "Miss Andy, Mom and I talked about this all night. She knows she was wrong about you, but it's not just about military service. It's about realizing that she judged someone based on scars instead of getting to know the person underneath them." His observation cut to the heart of issues that extended beyond Andy's specific situation to encompass broader questions about how communities treated veterans with visible combat injuries. Linda's prejudice had been based on assumptions about damage rather than investigation of character, creating barriers that had prevented authentic relationship building. "Cameron's right," Linda admitted, her voice carrying genuine remorse. "I made assumptions about your background and capabilities based on appearance, and those assumptions prevented me from appreciating someone who's been a positive influence in my son's life." Andy accepted Linda's recognition of error, while remaining cautious about whether changed attitudes would prove sustainable when the novelty of her military recognition faded. People sometimes offered dramatic apologies that weren't supported by consistent behavioral changes, making immediate forgiveness feel premature. "I appreciate your honesty, Mrs. Mills," Andy replied. Building authentic relationships takes time and consistent interaction based on who people actually are, rather than assumptions about what they represent. Reverend Matt Fisher entered Palmer's Diner with several elderly parishioners whose animated conversations suggested they'd been discussing community developments that had captured their collective imagination. His expression carried pastoral concern mixed with obvious pride in claiming Andy as a member of his congregation's extended community family. "Andy," Reverend Fisher said warmly, "I hope you don't mind that I've been fielding calls from other ministers throughout East Texas who've heard about our decorated veteran. The Regional Methodist Conference is interested in having you speak at their annual Veterans Memorial Service." The request represented another form of institutional attention that could expose Andy to exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd hoped to avoid through her carefully maintained anonymity. Religious organizations often possessed connections to military chaplains and veteran services that could access information about classified operations through channels she couldn't control. "Reverend Fisher, I'm honored by the invitation, but I'm not comfortable with public speaking about military service that involved sensitive operations," quote, she said, using the deflection that had become her standard response to recognition that felt more burdensome than rewarding. "I understand your reluctance," Reverend Fisher replied, "but Andy, your story represents the kind of selfless service that inspires people to examine their own contributions to community welfare. Sometimes, sharing painful experiences helps others process their own struggles with trauma and recovery." His perspective touched on therapeutic concepts that Andy's counselors had discussed during her treatment at Walter Reed Medical Center. Sharing traumatic experiences with appropriate audiences could provide healing benefits for both speakers and listeners, though it also carried risks of re-traumatization that had to be carefully managed. Walt Gibson entered the diner with measured steps that reflected his advanced age, but his bearing carried the dignity that had made him a respected voice in Fox Hollow's veteran community for decades. His presence immediately commanded attention from everyone present, as his opinions about military service carried weight that transcended generational differences. "Captain Wells," Gibson said formally, settling onto a counter stool with obvious respect for someone whose service record had exceeded his previous understanding. "I wanted to apologize for Frank Montgomery's behavior last night. His interrogation was inappropriate and reflected leadership failures that don't represent our post's values." Andy poured coffee for Gibson while processing the complex dynamics that Montgomery's challenge had created within Fox Hollow's veteran community. His skepticism about her background had exposed divisions between older veterans who expected detailed explanations and younger ones who understood that some service couldn't be discussed publicly. "Mr. Gibson, Colonel Montgomery was doing what he thought was necessary to protect the post's reputation," Andy replied diplomatically. His methods were aggressive, but his concerns about verifying volunteer qualifications weren't unreasonable. They were completely unreasonable when directed at someone whose obvious combat injuries should have earned respect rather than suspicion, Gibson countered firmly. "Frank's been used to being the most senior officer in our community, and your presence challenges assumptions about military hierarchy that he's never had to examine." The observation highlighted competitive dynamics that Andy had hoped to avoid through her civilian employment and quiet community service. Military rank carried social implications that could create tensions with other veterans who might feel their own achievements were diminished by comparison to her Navy Cross recognition. "Mr. Gibson, I never intended to challenge anyone's authority or position in the veteran community," Andy said, her tone carrying sincerity that she hoped would prevent additional conflicts. "I just wanted to contribute quietly without drawing attention to military service that included experiences I'd rather not revisit publicly." "That humility is exactly what makes your service so remarkable," Gibson replied, stirring sugar into coffee while studying Andy's scarred face with understanding that came from his own combat experience. "Real heroes don't seek recognition. They usually run from it because they understand the true cost of the actions that earned them decoration." His assessment felt uncomfortably accurate, touching on psychological complexities that Andy continued to wrestle with during therapy sessions focused on accepting recognition for actions that had cost her so much personally. The Navy Cross represented both achievement and loss, heroism and trauma, pride and devastating change to her life trajectory. Bobby Ray Tucker pushed through the diner's front door with obvious excitement about developments that had transformed Fox Hollow's understanding of one of their community members. His own visible combat injuries provided common ground with Andy that had made their limited interactions comfortable despite her general wariness about veteran relationships. "Captain Wells," Bobby Ray announced, approaching the counter with energy that suggested important news to share. "I just got off the phone with my buddy at the VA regional office. They're fast-tracking a review of your disability benefits based on your Navy Cross citation and current employment status." The information confirmed Andy's fears about official attention that could expose aspects of her background she'd hoped to keep private. VA reviews required detailed medical examinations and service record evaluations that could reveal information about classified operations through channels she couldn't control. "What kind of review?" Andy asked, though she suspected the answer would involve exactly the kind of institutional scrutiny she was psychologically unprepared to handle. "Full disability rating reassessment with potential increases based on service-connected injuries that might not have been properly documented during your original medical evaluation," Bobby Ray explained, consulting notes from his conversation with federal officials. "They're also reviewing your eligibility for specialized veteran services that are only available to recipients of Valor decorations." Andy felt overwhelmed by the cascade of attention that had followed Montgomery's forced disclosure of her military background. What had begun as community curiosity was expanding into institutional recognition that could fundamentally change her relationship with both Fox Hollow and the broader veteran services system. "Bobby Ray, I appreciate the information, but I'm not sure I want to pursue benefit increases or additional services," she said, hoping to limit her exposure to bureaucratic processes that could expose more details about her classified naval career. "Captain, with respect, this isn't about what you want," Bobby Ray replied gently. "This is about ensuring that someone who earned the Navy Cross through actions that ended their military career receives appropriate compensation and support for service-connected injuries." His perspective highlighted ethical dimensions of veteran benefits that Andy hadn't fully considered during her years of maintaining minimal contact with VA services. Her reluctance to seek recognition might actually represent a disservice to other veterans, whose benefit claims could be strengthened by examples of properly documented combat-related disabilities. As Palmer's Diner continued filling with residents seeking glimpses of their newly famous community member, Andy realized that her carefully constructed quiet life had been permanently transformed by revelations that would require fundamental adjustments to how she managed both public attention and private recovery from military trauma. The intersection of community pride, institutional interest, and personal privacy had created circumstances that demanded choices about how much recognition she was willing to accept and how much scrutiny she could psychologically tolerate while maintaining the civilian identity that had become essential to her mental health. Standing behind the familiar grill where she'd found purpose and routine during 3 years of anonymous service, Andy understood that some changes couldn't be reversed, and that the hero's recognition she'd never sought was now hers to manage, regardless of her preferences about privacy or public attention. 3 weeks after the VFW meeting that had changed everything, Andy Wells stood in Fox Hollow General Hospital's break room, reviewing a letter from the Secretary of the Navy that had arrived via certified mail that morning. The official correspondence invited her to Washington, D.C. for a ceremony honoring Navy Cross recipients, complete with Pentagon protocol officers and media coverage that represented exactly the kind of institutional attention she'd spent years avoiding. Dr. Michelle Adams entered the break room carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been monitoring Andy's emotional state since news of the invitation had spread through the hospital's administrative offices. Her concern was professional, but also personal, reflecting relationships that had deepened as Andy's military background became integrated with her civilian identity. "How are you processing the Navy Department's invitation?" Dr. Adams asked, settling into the chair across from Andy with the careful attention of someone prepared to provide support if needed. Andy folded the letter with movements that remained steady despite internal turbulence that felt like standing in tide pools where waves kept shifting the sand beneath her feet. "I'm not sure attending a ceremony in Washington serves any purpose other than satisfying institutional requirements for honoring Valor decorations." "Maybe," Dr. Adams replied thoughtfully, "or maybe participating in recognition ceremonies helps other veterans understand that seeking help and accepting community support doesn't diminish their service or their strength." The observation touched on therapeutic concepts that Andy's counselors had discussed during her ongoing treatment for combat-related trauma. Public recognition could provide healing benefits not just for recipients, but for other veterans who needed examples of successful transition from military to civilian identity. "Dr. Adams, I appreciate the perspective, but I'm still processing how to manage recognition that feels more overwhelming than rewarding." Andy said, consulting her phone where text messages had been accumulating from veteran organizations, historical societies, and media representatives who'd somehow obtained her contact information. Sheriff Carl Patterson appeared in the break room doorway with the measured pace that had come to characterize his interactions with Andy since her military background became public knowledge. His expression carried official concern mixed with protective instincts that had made him an unofficial buffer between her privacy needs and external attention. "Andy, I hate to interrupt your break, but Colonel Montgomery is here asking to speak with you," Patterson said, his tone suggesting he'd already evaluated the request and found it appropriate rather than intrusive. "He says it's important and won't take long." The mention of Montgomery sent familiar anxiety through Andy's chest, though 3 weeks of processing had helped her understand that their confrontation at the VFW post had been as difficult for him as it had been for her. His public challenge to her credentials had exposed his own limitations as a leader while forcing her to confront psychological defenses that had become counterproductive. "Did he say what he wanted to discuss?" Andy asked, though she suspected Montgomery's request involved the complicated aftermath of their public conflict. "He mentioned wanting to make amends in a way that goes beyond the apology he offered at the meeting," Patterson replied. "Frank's been struggling with how his behavior reflected on the post and on his own military leadership record." Andy considered the request while weighing her emotional capacity for additional difficult conversations about military service and community relationships. Montgomery's challenge had ultimately forced positive changes to her situation, but the process had been traumatic enough that she remained wary of further interaction with someone whose judgment had proved so flawed. "I'll speak with him," she decided, recognizing that avoiding the conversation would probably create more complications than addressing it directly. Montgomery waited in the hospital's main lobby with posture that conveyed military bearing, tempered by obvious discomfort about the circumstances that had brought him there. His civilian clothes and nervous energy marked him as someone operating outside his normal comfort zone, seeking reconciliation rather than exercising the authority that had characterized their previous encounters. "Captain Wells," Montgomery said, standing as Andy approached, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I know my behavior at the VFW meeting caused you distress that I had no right to create." Andy studied his expression, recognizing genuine remorse, mixed with the kind of professional embarrassment that came from realizing he'd failed to meet his own standards for military leadership. His acknowledgement of error seemed more thorough than the brief apology he'd offered immediately after her tattoo revelation. "Colonel Montgomery, what can I do for you?" she asked, maintaining the formal tone that had characterized their limited interaction since the evening, that had exposed both her heroism and his prejudice. "I wanted to discuss how the post can support you in managing attention that our meeting generated," Montgomery said, consulting notes that suggested he'd prepared carefully for their conversation. "Media requests, veteran organization inquiries, institutional recognition ceremonies, all attention that you never sought but now have to navigate because of my inappropriate challenge to your credentials." His offer represented a significant shift from the skepticism that had defined his previous approach to her military background. Montgomery seemed to understand that his actions had contributed to exposure that was causing Andy genuine psychological distress, and he was attempting to provide practical support for managing consequences of his poor judgment. "I appreciate the gesture, Colonel, but I'm not sure how the VFW post can help with institutional attention that extends beyond Fox Hollow's community boundaries," Andy replied, though she was curious about what specific support he might be prepared to offer. "The post has connections throughout the veteran community that can provide advice about managing recognition while maintaining privacy," Montgomery explained. "Other decorated veterans who've navigated similar challenges, legal resources for controlling media access, advocacy services that can interface with federal agencies on your behalf." His proposal suggested that Montgomery had been researching the complexities that accompanied high-level military recognition, educating himself about challenges that he should have understood before questioning her background so aggressively. The effort felt genuine rather than performative, though Andy remained cautious about accepting help from someone whose judgment had already proved unreliable. "Colonel, why is this important to you?" Andy asked, seeking to understand motivations that might extend beyond simple guilt about his behavior at the VFW meeting. Montgomery was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands with the kind of introspection that suggested he was wrestling with personal issues that extended beyond their specific conflict. When he spoke, his voice carried vulnerability that marked a significant departure from the authoritative tone that had characterized their previous interactions. Because in 30 years of military service, I never faced the kind of situation that earned you the Navy Cross, he said quietly. I served honorably, but I never had opportunities to demonstrate the kind of heroism that defines the very best of American military tradition. When you appeared in our community with obvious combat injuries, I should have recognized someone whose service had exceeded my own achievements. His admission represented the kind of honest self-assessment that Andy had rarely heard from senior military officers, who typically maintained professional facades that didn't acknowledge limitations or comparative deficiencies. Montgomery's recognition that her service had surpassed his own carried implications about military hierarchy and recognition that felt both validating and uncomfortable. Colonel, military service takes many forms, and not everyone has opportunities to serve in situations that result in valor decorations, Andy replied, attempting to provide perspective that didn't diminish his own contributions while acknowledging the fundamental differences in their operational experience. That's true, Montgomery agreed, but Captain, leadership requires recognizing and supporting exceptional service regardless of whether it matches your own background. I failed in that responsibility, both as a post commander and as a senior officer who should have understood what your injuries and your reluctance to discuss your service actually represented. His analysis of his leadership failures felt accurate and demonstrated understanding of military principles that should have guided his initial approach to her background. Andy appreciated his willingness to examine his behavior critically, though she remained uncertain about whether accepting his support would help or complicate her ongoing efforts to manage unwanted attention. Garrett Webb entered the hospital lobby with the unhurried pace that had come to characterize his approach to situations requiring careful navigation. His presence provided emotional support that Andy had learned to value during moments when she felt overwhelmed by complications that extended beyond her direct control. "Andy," Garrett said, nodding respectfully to Montgomery, "Dr. Adams mentioned you might need some friendly backup for a difficult conversation." His offer of support represented exactly the kind of authentic relationship that Andy had hoped to build in Fox Hollow, connection based on genuine care rather than fascination with her military achievements. Garrett's consistent friendship had provided stability during weeks of adjustment to recognition that felt more burdensome than rewarding. "Thank you, but Colonel Montgomery and I are just discussing ways the VFW post might help manage attention that our previous meeting generated," Andy said, including both men in conversation that could benefit from multiple perspectives about community support and institutional navigation. "Actually," Montgomery said, his tone suggesting he'd reached a decision about something he'd been considering throughout their conversation, "I was hoping to propose something more specific than general support services." Andy felt familiar apprehension at the prospect of additional complications, though Montgomery's demeanor suggested his proposal was designed to help rather than create new challenges for her situation. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. "The post would like to sponsor your attendance at the Navy Department ceremony in Washington, covering all expenses while providing veteran escorts who can help you manage media attention and protocol requirements," Montgomery said, consulting notes that indicated he'd researched the logistics involved in attending such events. "More importantly, we'd like to establish a community scholarship in your name for local students pursuing careers in emergency medical services." His proposal represented recognition that honored her military service while supporting Fox Hollow community development in ways that aligned with her civilian contributions to local healthcare. The scholarship concept provided ongoing positive impact that didn't require her continued public involvement or exposure to unwanted attention. "Colonel, that's very generous, but I'm not comfortable with scholarships that use my name or draw attention to my military background," Andy said, though she appreciated the thought process that had led to his proposal. "We anticipated that concern," Montgomery replied, "so the scholarship would honor Fox Hollow's decorated veterans without specific reference to individual recipients. Your privacy would be maintained while supporting education in fields where your expertise has benefited our community." Garrett studied Montgomery's proposal with the practical assessment that had made him a successful businessman in Fox Hollow's challenging economic environment. That approach provides community benefit without creating ongoing publicity pressure for Andy. It also establishes positive precedent for supporting other veterans who might want recognition without personal exposure. His evaluation highlighted practical benefits that extended beyond Andy's specific situation to encompass broader community approaches to honoring veteran service while respecting privacy needs. The scholarship concept could provide lasting positive impact that didn't depend on her continued involvement or public recognition. Cameron Mills burst through the hospital's main entrance with energy that had become his trademark, though his expression carried unusual seriousness that suggested important news to share. His presence immediately improved Andy's emotional state, as his friendship had remained consistent despite revelations that had transformed how many community members interacted with her. "Miss Andy!" Cameron called out, approaching their small group with obvious excitement. "I just heard about the scholarship idea, and I wanted to tell you something amazing." Andy smiled at the teenager's enthusiasm, appreciating his ability to find positive aspects in situations that often felt overwhelming to her. "What's got you so excited, Cameron?" "I've been accepted to the EMT training program at the community college," Cameron announced, his pride evident in both his posture and his voice. "The program director said my application essay about learning emergency response from a decorated Navy veteran made me stand out from other candidates." His news represented exactly the kind of positive community impact that could result from her revealed military background, suggesting that recognition might provide benefits that extended beyond her personal discomfort with attention. Cameron's acceptance into emergency medical training created tangible good from exposure that had felt purely negative. "That's wonderful, Cameron," Andy said, genuine pleasure at his achievement temporarily overriding her anxiety about the attention that had made his acceptance possible. "You'll make an excellent EMT. The best part is that they want me to help develop training scenarios based on real combat medical situations," Cameron continued, his excitement building as he shared details about program opportunities. "Nothing classified, just general approaches to trauma response under pressure. They said having access to someone with your experience could make our regional EMT training one of the best programs in East Texas." His enthusiasm highlighted possibilities for positive community contribution that Andy hadn't considered during her focus on managing unwanted recognition. Her military medical expertise could provide educational value that helped develop local emergency response capabilities while honoring her service in ways that felt meaningful rather than exploitative. Mayor Phil Barnes appeared in the hospital lobby with the slightly hurried demeanor that characterized his approach to managing multiple community responsibilities simultaneously. His presence suggested that their conversation had attracted official attention, though his expression conveyed support rather than concern about developments affecting one of Fox Hollow's most prominent residents. "Captain Wells, Colonel Montgomery, gentlemen," Barnes said, including everyone in greetings that acknowledged both Andy's military rank and the community significance of their discussion. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to share some news about regional response to Fox Hollow's decorated veteran story." Andy felt familiar anxiety at the prospect of additional attention, though Barnes' tone suggested his news might involve positive developments rather than complications requiring crisis management. "What kind of response?" Andy asked. "The East Texas Veterans Affairs Regional Office called to discuss establishing Fox Hollow as a pilot location for rural veteran services," Barnes explained, consulting notes about federal program opportunities. "They're interested in our community's successful integration of a highly decorated veteran, and they want to study our approaches to supporting military personnel during civilian transition." His news represented institutional recognition that extended beyond Andy's individual situation to encompass Fox Hollow's broader veteran community support systems. The federal interest suggested that their town's approach to honoring military service while respecting privacy needs had attracted positive attention from agencies responsible for veteran welfare throughout the region. "Mayor Barnes, does this federal program require my continued involvement, or can it proceed based on community systems that exist independently of individual veterans?" Andy asked, seeking to understand whether the opportunity would create ongoing pressure for her participation in activities she preferred to avoid. "The program focuses on community infrastructure and support systems rather than individual case studies," Barnes replied, offering reassurance that addressed her primary concern about continued exposure. "Your presence certainly validates our community's veteran support capabilities, but the federal interest is in replicating Fox Hollow's approach in other rural areas throughout the region." Montgomery listened to Barnes' explanation with obvious interest, recognizing opportunities for Fox Hollow's veteran community to provide leadership that extended beyond their immediate geographic boundaries. "Mayor, this federal program could position our VFW post to provide consultation and training for veteran organizations throughout East Texas." His observation highlighted positive developments that could result from the attention Andy's revelation had generated, creating opportunities for Fox Hollow to serve as a model for rural communities struggling to support veteran transition and recognition needs. As their impromptu gathering in the hospital lobby continued, Andy realized that the forced exposure of her military background had initiated changes that extended far beyond her personal situation to encompass broader community development and regional veteran services improvement. The recognition she'd never wanted was creating positive impact that honored her service while benefiting people throughout East Texas who shared similar challenges. Colonel Montgomery, Andy said after considering the various proposals and opportunities that had emerged from their conversation, "I'm willing to accept the VFW post support for attending the Navy Department ceremony, and I think the scholarship idea could provide real benefit for students like Cameron who want to serve their communities through emergency medical training." Her acceptance represented a fundamental shift in her approach to recognition, choosing to embrace opportunities that could provide positive community impact rather than continuing to resist attention that was already beyond her control to manage. "Thank you, Captain," Montgomery replied, his relief evident as someone who'd been genuinely concerned about making amends for behavior that had violated his own standards for military leadership. "The post will handle all logistics while ensuring your privacy needs are respected throughout the process." 6 months later, Andy Wells stood behind the grill at Palmer's Diner, preparing breakfast for residents who'd grown accustomed to having a Navy Cross recipient cooking their morning eggs. The initial sensation of her revealed military background had settled into comfortable community pride that honored her service without making it the sole focus of her civilian identity. Cameron Mills, now halfway through his EMT training, stopped by each morning for coffee and conversation that had evolved to include discussion of trauma response techniques that Andy could share without violating classification restrictions about her naval service. Their relationship had deepened as mentor and student, while maintaining the friendship that had provided her with emotional support during difficult transitions. Colonel Montgomery entered Palmer's Diner with the dignity that had returned to his bearing once he'd found ways to support Andy that addressed his leadership failures during their initial conflict. The VFW scholarship had funded 3 students' emergency medical training, creating lasting positive impact that honored decorated service while supporting community development. "Good morning, Captain," Montgomery said, settling onto his usual stool with coffee that Andy poured automatically. "How was the Veterans Hospital consultation in Houston?" Andy had begun accepting speaking engagements that focused on military medical training and veteran transition support, sharing expertise that helped other communities develop support systems for combat-injured personnel. The work provided meaningful purpose that utilized her background while respecting her privacy needs about specific operational details. "Productive," she replied, flipping hash browns with movements that had become meditation during months of processing recognition that no longer felt burdensome. 3 more rural hospitals are implementing trauma training programs based on combat medical principles adapted for civilian emergency response. Her consultation work had created a model for translating military medical expertise into civilian healthcare improvement, providing career purpose that honored her naval service while building the kind of meaningful civilian identity she'd been seeking since her medical retirement. Through Palmer's Diner windows, Fox Hollow's main street stretched under morning sunlight that illuminated a community that had learned to balance pride in their decorated veteran with respect for her privacy and autonomy. The scholarship students were beginning their careers in emergency medical services, providing tangible benefit that would serve East Texas for decades. Andy Wells had discovered that some recognition couldn't be avoided, but it could be managed in ways that honored service while supporting the kind of community contribution that provided healing for both heroes and the people they'd sworn to protect. Her scars would always tell stories of sacrifice, but Fox Hollow had learned that the most important stories weren't always the most visible ones, and that true heroism often preferred quiet service to public acclaim. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoy this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.